Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Ruby Mountains of northeastern Nevada, in a place where the ancient Shoshone once whispered warnings about things that walk in stolen skins. Michael and I had been planning this trip for months. After 3 years of marriage, we desperately needed time away from the suffocating routine of our suburban Phoenix life. He'd found this remote camping spot near Lamoille Canyon, tucked away in the Ruby Mountains wilderness. The photos online showed pristine alpine lakes, towering peaks, and endless silence. Exactly what we craved. No cell service for 50 miles, Michael had said with genuine excitement, waving his phone. Just us, nature, and real conversation. I should have seen that as a warning. We drove through Elko just after noon on a Thursday in late September, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you believe the world is still good. The town felt like a relic. Weathered buildings, sun-bleached signs, and locals who watched our shiny Honda Pilot with the subtle suspicion reserved for outsiders. Michael stopped for last-minute supplies at a gas station on the edge of town. The clerk, a leathery man with eyes like chips of flint, glanced at our camping gear through the window. "Ruby Mountains, huh?" "Lamoille Canyon area," Michael confirmed, loading up on trail mix and batteries. "Ever been up there?" The man's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes things wander down from those peaks, things that ain't what they seem." He rang up our purchases with deliberate slowness. Shoshone got stories about that country, old stories. I laughed, actually laughed at what seemed like typical small-town superstition. "We'll keep an eye out for bears." The clerk didn't smile back. "Bears ain't what you need to worry about." The drive up Highway 227 toward Lamoille took us through increasingly desolate country. Rolling sagebrush gave way to pine forests, and the temperature dropped with each mile of elevation. By the time we reached the trailhead, shadows were already stretching long across the valley floor. Our campsite was a 3-mile hike from the parking area, tucked into a grove of aspens beside a mountain lake Michael had found on some obscure hiking forum. Hidden Emerald Lake, he called it, though no official map showed that name. The trail was barely marked, winding through dense undergrowth that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. "This is perfect," I said when we finally reached the clearing. The lake stretched before us like black glass, perfectly still despite the breeze that whispered through the aspens. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the soft rush of wind in leaves. We set up camp with practiced efficiency, our bright orange tent looking almost garish against the subdued colors of dusk. Michael gathered firewood while I arranged our supplies, but something felt off about the space. The ground around our tent was bare earth, packed hard as concrete, while just feet away, lush grass grew in every direction. It was as if nothing would take root in this particular spot. "Strange how nothing grows here," I mentioned when Michael returned with an armload of deadfall. He shrugged, dropping the wood in a neat pile. "Probably just rocky soil." But I noticed he avoided looking directly at the barren patch. The fire caught easily. Too easily. The flames leaped higher than they should have, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. We roasted hot dogs and shared a bottle of wine as full darkness settled over the mountains. But conversation felt strained. Every time one of us spoke, our voices seemed to die just feet from our mouths, swallowed by the peculiar quality of the air. "Listen," Michael said suddenly, holding up his hand. I strained my ears but heard nothing. "To what?" "Exactly. No night sounds, no owls, no coyotes, nothing." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the black sky. "It's like everything's holding its breath." That night, I woke to the sensation of being watched. Our tent was zipped tight, and Michael slept deeply beside me, but I could feel eyes on us through the thin nylon walls. My heart hammered as I lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Outside, something circled our campsite with footsteps that sounded wrong, too light for their spacing, as if whatever walked out there barely touched the ground. The footsteps stopped directly outside our tent. Through the orange fabric, I could make out a shape, tall, impossibly thin, swaying slightly in the windless night. It stood there for what felt like hours, and I lay frozen, sweat beading on my forehead despite the mountain cold. When I woke the next morning, Michael was already up, stirring the coals of our fire back to life. Sunlight filtered through the aspens, and the oppressive feeling of the night seemed like a bad dream. "Sleep well?" he asked, not looking up from the flames. "Strange dreams," I lied, not wanting to sound paranoid. "You?" "Like a rock." But there were dark circles under his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he worked. Our second day passed uneventfully. We hiked around the lake, took photos of the stunning scenery, and tried to recapture the enthusiasm we'd felt planning this trip. But something had changed between us, or maybe in us. We spoke in clipped sentences, jumping at unexpected sounds, constantly glancing over our shoulders. The mountains felt different in daylight, older somehow, as if we were trespassing in a place humans weren't meant to be. That evening, as we prepared dinner, Michael's phone chimed. We both stared at it in shock. We hadn't had signal since leaving Elko. "That's impossible," he muttered, checking the screen. One bar of service flickered in and out of existence. "There's a message." The text was from an unknown number. "She's not who she seems." "What the hell?" Michael showed me the screen, but the message was already gone, the signal dead. "Did you see that?" I nodded, feeling ice form in my stomach. Some kind of prank? But we both knew no one had this number except family, and certainly no one who would send cryptic messages to a dead zone in the Nevada wilderness. The fire that night wouldn't stay lit. We'd build it up, and within minutes the flames would shrink to barely glowing embers, no matter how much dry wood we added. Michael grew increasingly frustrated, poking and prodding, muttering curses under his breath. "It's like the air itself is wrong," he said finally, giving up on the fire, "like it won't burn properly." We went to bed early, huddled together in our sleeping bags as the temperature plummeted. I drifted in and out of sleep, plagued by dreams of things moving just outside my vision, always in my peripheral vision, always just beyond recognition. I woke to Michael shaking me gently. Jen, wake up." "What?" I mumbled, disoriented. The tent was filled with pale pre-dawn light. "I need to take a leak, but—" He hesitated, looking embarrassed. "This is going to sound crazy, but I don't want to go alone." That's when I knew he'd felt it too, the watching, the wrongness that seemed to permeate this place. "It's okay," I said, unzipping my sleeping bag. "I'll come with you." We dressed quickly and stepped outside into air so cold it burned our lungs. The lake was covered with a thin skin of ice that reflected the mountains like a broken mirror. Michael walked toward a cluster of pines at the edge of camp while I stood guard, scanning the tree line for movement. He'd been gone for maybe 3 minutes when I heard him call out, "Jen, come here. You need to see this." Something in his voice made my skin crawl, a forced casualness that didn't match the urgency beneath. I followed his voice toward the pines, pushing through low branches that grabbed at my jacket like skeletal fingers. I found him standing in a small clearing, staring at something on the ground. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Arranged in a perfect circle were animal bones. Deer, rabbits, maybe a coyote, all bleached white and positioned with ritualistic precision. In the center sat a small pile of what looked like shed skin, papery and translucent. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. Michael turned to look at me, and for just a moment his expression was completely blank, not confused or frightened, but empty, as if no one was looking out through his eyes. Then he blinked, and he was Michael again, pale and shaken. I don't know, some kind of altar? Should we get out of here? I wanted to say yes, wanted to pack up immediately and hike back to the car, but something stopped me. Maybe it was stubborn refusal to let fear ruin our vacation, or maybe something else. Something that whispered we couldn't leave, not yet. Let's just keep it between us, I heard myself saying. No point in getting worked up over some weird hunting ritual. But it wasn't hunters who had arranged those bones with such careful precision, and we both knew it. The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. We broke camp mechanically, neither of us acknowledging the decision to leave, but both understanding it was time. As we stuffed our gear into backpacks, I noticed our supplies had somehow diminished overnight. The bag of trail mix was nearly empty, though we'd barely touched it. One of our water bottles was missing entirely. "Did you move the water?" I asked Michael. He paused in rolling up his sleeping bag. "What water?" "We had 4 bottles. Now there's only 3. He looked genuinely confused, which frightened me more than if he'd admitted to losing it. Maybe we drank more yesterday than we thought. But I knew, with the certainty of someone who'd been managing our supplies carefully, that we hadn't. The hike back to the trailhead should have taken 3 hours. We walked for 5 and somehow ended up back at our original campsite. The orange tent was gone. Our fire ring was cold ashes, but we were unmistakably in the same clearing beside the same lake. "This is impossible," Michael said, checking his GPS. The device showed our location as a blank gray area, no map data available. We followed the trail, the same trail we came in on. I pulled out our paper map, spreading it on a fallen log. According to the topography, there should have been only one trail in and out of this area, a clear path following the contours of the valley. But the terrain around us didn't match what the map showed. The lake was the wrong shape, the peaks were in different positions, and the trail we'd followed seemed to have vanished entirely. "The map's wrong," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. Michael laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Or we're not where we think we are." We tried again, this time marking our path with torn pieces of bright fabric tied to branches. The sun was directly overhead when we started, but within what felt like an hour, it was setting behind the western peaks. Time itself seemed to be stuttering, skipping forward in impossible jumps. When we inevitably found ourselves back at the lake for the second time, Michael sat down heavily on a boulder and put his head in his hands. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This can't be happening." I wanted to comfort him, but I was fighting my own rising panic. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. We were disoriented, reading the map wrong, following game trails instead of the main path, but a deeper, more primitive part of my brain was screaming warnings in a language I couldn't understand. "We'll figure it out in the morning," I said, though the idea of spending another night here made my stomach churn. "Maybe we're just tired." That's when Michael looked up at me with those same empty eyes I'd seen by the bone circle. "You're right. We should stay." And I realized with growing horror that I'd been about to suggest the same thing, not because it made sense, but because something wanted us to stay. We made camp again in the exact same spot, the bare patch of earth that nothing would grow in. The tent went up easily, our movements automatic, as if we'd done this same routine 1,000 times before. Neither of us spoke about how our destroyed campsite had been restored, complete with a ring of stones we definitely hadn't arranged. As darkness fell, the wrongness intensified. The fire, when we finally got it lit, burned with colors that don't exist in nature, deep purples and sickly greens that hurt to look at directly. The flames cast shadows that moved independently, reaching toward us with grasping fingers before retreating when we tried to focus on them. "Jen," Michael said quietly, staring into the bizarre fire, "do you remember how we met?" The question caught me off guard. Of course, college, that terrible geology class. He nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. What was the professor's name? I opened my mouth to answer and found nothing. The memory was there. Boring lectures, uncomfortable lab stools, Michael sitting 3 rows ahead, but the details were fuzzy, as if viewed through frosted glass. I can't remember, I admitted. Neither can I. His voice was barely a whisper. I can't remember my mother's maiden name, or where I went to high school, or... He looked at me with growing panic. Jen, what's your middle name? I felt the blood drain from my face. Another memory that should have been automatic, fundamental, was simply gone. Not forgotten, gone, as if it had never existed. Something's taking our memories, I said, the words feeling like ice in my mouth. Michael stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the firelight. No, that's impossible. We're just stressed, disoriented. People forget things. But even as he spoke, I could see him struggling, reaching for memories that were no longer there. His movements were becoming less fluid, more jerky, as if he was learning how to inhabit his own body. That night, I lay awake, listening to Michael's breathing beside me. But something was wrong with the rhythm. Too shallow, too quick, like a poor imitation of sleep. When I turned to look at him in the darkness, his eyes were open, staring at the tent ceiling with unblinking intensity. "Michael?" I whispered. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. His chest rose and fell in that same artificial rhythm, and saliva had begun to pool at the corner of his mouth. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and he turned his head toward me with mechanical precision. In the dim light filtering through the tent, his face looked wrong, the features slightly off, as if someone had tried to rebuild Michael from memory and gotten the proportions just slightly incorrect. "Go to sleep, Jennifer," he said in Michael's voice, but the cadence was wrong, the inflection artificial. I pretended to close my eyes but watched him through barely parted lids. He continued staring at the ceiling for hours, never blinking, that strange smile never leaving his lips. Near dawn, I must have actually dozed, because when I opened my eyes, he was sleeping normally again, and the wrongness from the night felt like another bad dream. Except for the pile of shed skin beside his sleeping bag, translucent and delicate, like the molt of some enormous insect. I slipped out of the tent while he slept, trying not to look too closely at the discarded whatever it was. The morning air was bitter cold, and my breath came in white puffs that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. The lake was frozen solid now, the ice thick and black as obsidian. As I walked toward the water's edge, I noticed footprints in the frost, my own from just moments before, but also another set. Larger, with too much space between the toes, as if whatever made them had feet that were almost, but not quite, human. The tracks led from our tent, around the lake, and back again in a perfect circle. But that wasn't what made my heart stop. It was the realization that there was only one set of returning prints. Something had left our camp during the night, but 2 things had come back. Beautiful morning. I spun around to find Michael, or the thing wearing Michael's face, standing just behind me. He was dressed and ready for the day, his backpack already on his shoulders. "Ready to head out?" he asked with that same artificial cheerfulness. I studied his face, looking for some sign of the man I'd married. The features were right, the voice was right, but the essence was gone. This thing moved like Michael, spoke like Michael, but it watched me with the calculating patience of a predator. "Sure," I managed, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Just let me pack up." As I walked back to the tent, I could feel those not quite right eyes following my every movement. My hands shook as I stuffed our gear into my backpack, and I had to fight the urge to run screaming into the forest. But where could I go? We were trapped in this impossible place, caught in some kind of loop that bent space and time around us like a spider's web. The thing that wasn't Michael helped me break down the tent with mechanical efficiency. Its movements were too precise, too deliberate, like someone following written instructions rather than working from muscle memory. When our hands accidentally touched, its skin was cold as the morning air. "Which way should we go?" it asked, shouldering its pack. I pointed toward what I hoped was the trail back to the parking area, though nothing looked familiar in the strange morning light. The aspens had shed their leaves overnight, leaving bare branches that reached toward the sky like grasping fingers. The whole forest felt dead, waiting. We walked in silence for hours, following game trails that appeared and disappeared without warning. The thing beside me maintained a steady pace, never tiring, never stopping to rest. It didn't sweat despite the exertion, didn't breathe hard on the steeper climbs. When I stumbled over a root, it caught my arm with reflexes that were too fast, too sure. "Careful," it said with Michael's voice, but there was no real concern in the tone. It was simply saying what it thought I expected to hear. By midday, we were completely lost. The sun overhead seemed wrong too. Too bright, too large, casting shadows that fell in impossible directions. My GPS was worse than useless, showing our location as coordinates that placed us somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "We should rest," the Michael thing suggested, settling onto a fallen log with fluid grace. "You look tired." I was exhausted, but the thought of stopping here, of being still while that thing studied me with its patient, hungry eyes, made my skin crawl. Still, I needed to think, to plan. I sat on a rock across from it, maintaining as much distance as possible. "Michael," I said carefully, "tell me about our first date." It tilted its head slightly, processing the request. "Dinner," it said finally. "We went to dinner." "Where?" A longer pause. "That place with the food." My blood turned to ice. Michael could be forgetful about a lot of things, but our first date was special to him. He'd planned it for weeks, taking me to a tiny Italian restaurant where the owner's grandmother made fresh pasta by hand. He'd told the story dozens of times, remembering every detail down to what wine we'd ordered. This thing wearing his face had no access to those memories. It was improvising, trying to fill gaps in stolen identity with generic responses. "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "The food place." It nodded, satisfied that its deception was working, but I could see it watching me more carefully now, perhaps sensing that something had changed between us. We resumed walking, but now I was planning. The thing was physically stronger than me, faster, and it knew this terrain in ways I didn't, but it was also still learning how to be human, still making subtle mistakes that revealed its true nature. If I could catch it off guard, maybe I had a chance. The opportunity came as we descended toward what looked like a stream valley. The trail was narrow here, with loose rocks that shifted treacherously underfoot. The Michael thing was ahead of me, moving with that same uncanny grace when it stepped wrong, or rather, stepped the way something with different joints and reflexes would step. Its foot came down on a loose stone, and instead of stumbling like a human would, it caught itself with a fluid motion that bent its ankle in directions human bones don't bend. For just a moment, its careful facade slipped, and I saw what it really was. Something long and predatory wearing Michael's skin like an ill-fitting suit. It realized its mistake immediately, turning to face me with eyes that were no longer trying to look human. The pretense was over. "You know," it said in Michael's voice, but the words came out wrong, the inflection alien. I didn't wait to hear what it had to say. I turned and ran. The forest erupted around me as I crashed through underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been Michael giving chase, but it wasn't bothering to sound human anymore. Its footsteps were too light, too quick, and between them I heard something that might have been laughter if laughter could sound like breaking glass. I ran without direction, driven only by the primitive need to escape. The terrain blurred past me. Pine trees, rocky outcrops, patches of snow that shouldn't have existed at this elevation. Time seemed to stutter again, and I found myself running through landscapes that couldn't all exist in the same place. High alpine meadows giving way to desert scrubland, then to dense forests of trees I didn't recognize. Finally, my lungs burning and legs shaking, I collapsed behind a massive boulder. My pursuer had gone silent, but I could feel it out there, patient as stone, waiting for me to make a mistake. That's when I heard Michael's voice calling my name. "Jen! Jen! Where are you? I'm hurt." It was a perfect imitation, down to the note of pain and confusion that made every instinct scream at me to help him. But I'd seen what was behind Michael's face, and I knew better than to trust anything in this place. "Please," the voice continued, closer now. "Something attacked me. I got away, but I'm bleeding. I need help." The words tugged at my heart even though I knew they were lies. Whatever this thing was, it understood human nature well enough to exploit our need to help those we love. I pressed myself deeper into the shadow of the boulder and waited. The voice called for another few minutes, moving in a search pattern that would have been logical for someone genuinely looking for a lost companion. But there was something too systematic about it, too methodical, like a computer running through possibilities rather than a person driven by emotion. Eventually, the calls faded into the distance, but I didn't move from my hiding place until the sun was low on the horizon and the forest was growing dark again. Whatever was hunting me might have given up for now, but I had no illusions about my safety. This place, whatever it was, didn't want to let me go. As night fell, I realized I had no choice but to find shelter. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and lost in terrain that seemed to change when I wasn't looking directly at it. I needed to rest, to think, to figure out some way back to the real world. I found a shallow cave in a rocky outcrop, barely large enough for me to crawl into but hidden from outside view. I gathered what dry wood I could find and built a small fire at the cave mouth, as much for psychological comfort as warmth. The flames burned normally here, steady and reassuring. The first natural thing I'd encountered since this nightmare began. Sitting in my tiny refuge, surrounded by dancing shadows, I tried to piece together what had happened to us. The bone circle, the memory loss, the way the landscape seemed to shift and change. It all pointed to something beyond normal understanding. The old man at the gas station had tried to warn us, mentioned Shoshone stories about things that weren't what they seemed. Skinwalkers. The word came to me unbidden, dredged up from some half-remembered documentary or late-night internet rabbit hole. Native American legends spoke of witches who could shed their human form and take on the appearance of animals or other people. They were said to haunt remote places, stealing identities and memories, feeding on the fear and confusion of their victims. But those were just stories, weren't they? Folklore to explain the unexplainable, primitive fears given supernatural form. Except I'd seen Michael's skin shed like a snake's, had watched something that looked like my husband move in ways human joints couldn't manage. I'd felt the wrongness of this place, the way it seemed to exist outside normal space and time. A sound outside my cave made me freeze, the soft scrape of something moving across rock. I held my breath, listening, but the noise didn't repeat. Still, I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched again, of predatory eyes studying my hiding place. "I know you're in there." The voice was Michael's, but it came from directly outside the cave entrance. Impossible. I would have seen anything approaching across the open ground. "I'm not angry," it continued in that familiar tone. "I understand why you ran. This place, it does things to people, makes them paranoid, suspicious, but I'm better now. I fought it off." I clutched a sharp piece of stone, the only weapon I had, and tried not to breathe. I know this seems crazy, but something was controlling me, like a parasite or a hitchhiker in my head. I could see what it was doing, hear what it was saying, but I couldn't stop it. The voice was closer now, just outside the cave mouth. "It wanted to hurt you, Jen, but I broke free. I'm me again." It was a good story, exactly what I might want to believe. The kind of explanation that would make all of this manageable, survivable. But I'd learned not to trust anything in this place. "Please," the voice continued, "I'm scared and alone, and I don't know how long I can keep fighting it. If you're really my wife, if you love me, you'll help me." The manipulation was subtle but effective, designed to make me feel guilty for protecting myself. It was playing on my love for Michael, my desire to believe he was still alive somewhere inside that stolen skin. I didn't answer, didn't move, barely breathed. After what felt like hours, I heard the sound of footsteps moving away from the cave. But I didn't trust that either. This thing was learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated in its deceptions. I spent the night huddled in that shallow cave, jumping at every sound, feeding small sticks to my fire to keep it from dying. Near dawn, exhaustion finally overcame fear, and I dozed fitfully. I woke to sunlight streaming through the cave opening and the sound of voices. Human voices, calling my name. Not Michael's voice this time, but others, unfamiliar but unmistakably real. "Jennifer Williams, if you can hear us, make some noise." I crawled to the cave entrance and peered out. 3 figures in search and rescue gear were working their way across the rocky slope below my hiding place. Relief flooded through me so intensely I nearly cried. "Here!" I called out, waving my arms. "I'm here!" They spotted me immediately and began climbing toward my position. As they got closer, I could see they were legitimate. Proper equipment, official patches, the kind of competent professionalism that spoke of real training and experience. "Mrs. Williams?" The lead searcher was a woman about my age with kind eyes and calloused hands. "I'm Sarah with Elko County Search and Rescue. Are you injured?" No, I don't think so." I was suddenly aware of how I must look. Dirty, scratched up, probably half crazy from exhaustion and fear. "How did you find me?" "Your husband reported you missing yesterday morning," she explained, helping me down from the rocks. "Said you went for a walk and never came back to camp. We've been searching since dawn." Yesterday morning? That was impossible. We'd been lost for days, caught in some kind of temporal loop, but I didn't try to explain. How could I? "Where is he?" I asked, accepting a bottle of water from one of the other rescuers. "Back at base camp with the sheriff's deputies. He's been beside himself with worry." Sarah studied my face with professional concern. "Are you sure you're not hurt? You seem disoriented." I nodded, though nothing made sense. If these people were real, and they certainly seemed real, then what had I experienced? Some kind of breakdown? Hallucinations brought on by dehydration and panic? But as we hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the forest for movement. Real or not, the fear remained. Something was watching us from the shadows between the trees, patient and hungry, waiting for another chance. The base camp was exactly where it should have been. A cluster of official vehicles and temporary shelters near the trailhead parking area. I could see our Honda Pilot sitting undisturbed, and beside it, a figure pacing back and forth with obvious anxiety. Michael. He looked up as our group approached, and his face transformed with relief. "Jen." Oh God, I was so scared. He ran toward us, and every instinct screamed at me to run the other way. But this was different. The searchers were here, witnesses, and this Michael moved like the man I'd married. His expressions were natural, his body language familiar. When he pulled me into a desperate hug, he smelled like himself. Soap and coffee and the cologne I'd bought him for Christmas. "I woke up, and you were gone," he said into my hair. "I looked everywhere, called your name until I was hoarse. When you didn't come back..." His voice broke with genuine emotion. I pulled back to study his face, looking for signs of the wrongness I'd seen before. But his eyes were Michael's eyes. Worried, relieved, completely human. No artificial movements, no uncanny valley dissonance. Either this thing had gotten much better at its impersonation, or... "Mrs. Williams?" Sarah touched my shoulder gently. "Do you remember what happened? How you got separated?" I looked around at the circle of concerned faces. The search team, the sheriff's deputies, Michael with his red-rimmed eyes and desperate expression. They were all waiting for an explanation that I couldn't give without sounding insane. "I went for a walk," I said finally. "Got turned around, panicked. I've never been good with directions." It was a lie, but a believable one. People got lost in the wilderness all the time, even experienced hikers. The human mind under stress could play terrible tricks, manufacture threats that didn't exist. But as we drove away from the Ruby Mountains, I caught Michael glancing at me in the rearview mirror. Just for a moment, his expression was calculating, evaluating, as if he was trying to determine how much I remembered. Or maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe the stress of being lost had damaged something in my ability to trust, to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. We drove home in relative silence, both of us processing what had happened in our own ways. Michael seemed genuinely shaken by my disappearance, constantly reaching over to touch my hand as if reassuring himself I was really there. His behavior was completely normal, completely human, except for one small thing. At a gas station outside of Elko, while Michael was inside paying for fuel, I noticed something in the passenger seat footwell. A small pile of what looked like dried skin, translucent and delicate, almost like the shed cocoon of some large insect. I picked it up with 2 fingers, holding it up to the light. It was definitely skin. I could see the texture, the pattern of pores, even what might have been follicles where hair had once grown. But it was too large to have come from any normal animal, and too fresh to have been carried in our car for long. When Michael returned, I showed him the strange object. "Any idea what this is?" He examined it with genuine puzzlement. "Probably just some trash that blew in when we had the windows down. You know how weird desert wind can be." His explanation was reasonable. His confusion seemed real. But as he tossed the skin out the window, I caught a glimpse of something underneath his sleeve, a patch of fresh, pink skin, as if he'd recently suffered a burn or abrasion that was healing with unusual speed. The drive back to Phoenix took 6 hours, and by the time we reached our suburban neighborhood, I'd almost convinced myself that everything had been a stress-induced hallucination. The mind was capable of remarkable self-deception. After all, people under extreme duress often experienced false memories, vivid dreams that seemed more real than reality itself. Our house looked exactly as we'd left it. Ordinary, safe, surrounded by the comforting banality of suburban life. Michael carried our gear inside while I checked the mail, performed the small rituals of returning home. Everything was normal. That night, I woke to find Michael standing at the bedroom window, perfectly still, staring out at the street with unblinking intensity. Moonlight fell across his face, and for just a moment his features looked wrong again, slightly off, as if someone had tried to recreate them from memory. "Michael?" I whispered. He turned toward me with that mechanical precision I remembered from the tent, his movements too fluid, too controlled. In the darkness, his eyes reflected light like an animal's. "Go back to sleep, Jennifer," he said in his own voice. But the cadence was wrong, the inflection artificial. I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep, but I could feel him watching me for the rest of the night. When morning came, he was normal again, making coffee, reading the news on his phone, discussing plans for the weekend. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. Over the following weeks, I began to notice small inconsistencies. Michael forgot our anniversary date, something that had never happened in 3 years of marriage. He couldn't remember the name of my childhood dog, despite having heard stories about Rex dozens of times. His taste in food shifted subtly. Suddenly, he loved seafood, which he'd always hated, and he'd lost his passion for horror movies that used to be his favorite genre. When I confronted him about these changes, he had reasonable explanations. Stress from work, getting older, evolving preferences. People changed all the time, he pointed out. It would be strange if he remained exactly the same person he'd been at 25. But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him studying me with that same calculating patience I'd seen in the forest. as if he was learning how to be my husband, memorizing the role through careful observation. 3 months after our camping trip, I found another pile of shed skin in our bathroom, hidden behind the toilet where I almost missed it. This time, I didn't show Michael. Instead, I wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and took it to a veterinarian friend who specialized in exotic animals. Dr. Martinez examined the sample under a microscope while I waited in her office, surrounded by photos of the unusual creatures she'd treated over the years. "This is very strange," she said finally, looking up from the eyepiece. "It's definitely epidermis, but the cellular structure is unusual, almost like it's from something that molts regularly, but the DNA markers suggest human origin. Is that possible?" She shrugged, clearly puzzled. "There are some rare genetic conditions that affect skin shedding, but nothing that would produce samples like this." "Where did you say you found it?" "Around the house. I thought maybe it was from a snake or something." "No, definitely not reptilian. And the size?" She held up the sample. "This would have come from something roughly human-sized, maybe larger." I thanked her and left with more questions than answers. That night, I lay awake listening to Michael's breathing, wondering what was sleeping beside me. He'd been getting up every few hours lately, claiming insomnia, but I'd started to suspect these midnight wanderings had a different purpose. The next morning, while Michael was at work, I decided to search our house more thoroughly. In the basement, behind some old Christmas decorations, I found a plastic storage bin I'd never seen before. Inside were dozens of pieces of shed skin, carefully preserved between sheets of wax paper like specimens in a collection. Some of the samples were obviously human, but others were different. Thicker, with unusual textures and patterns that didn't match any animal I could identify. At the bottom of the bin was a journal, written in Michael's handwriting but containing observations that made my blood run cold. Day 15. Integration proceeding successfully. Subject shows minimal awareness of changes. Memory implantation effective for major events, though minor details require ongoing adjustment. Day 23. Physical adaptation nearly complete. Motor functions now indistinguishable from original host. Emotional responses require continued practice. Day 31. Subject becoming suspicious. May need to accelerate timeline or implement contingency measures. The entries continued for weeks, documenting a systematic process of replacement and adaptation. Whatever had taken Michael's place was learning to be human through careful study and practice, refining its performance based on my reactions. The final entry was dated just 2 days ago. Day 67. Perfect integration achieved. Subject trust restored. Ready to begin second phase of harvest. Additional specimens will be required for expansion of territory. I dropped the journal as if it had burst into flames. The thing wearing Michael's face wasn't just replacing him, it was planning to use our home as a base for taking others. How many more people would disappear, replaced by perfect imitations that fooled even their loved ones? I heard the garage door opening. Michael was home early. I quickly replaced everything in the bin and pushed it back behind the decorations, then ran upstairs to compose myself. When he walked through the door, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, trying to look normal despite the terror clawing at my chest. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing my cheek with perfectly calibrated affection. "Fine," I managed. "How was work?" "The usual." He studied my face with those 2 observant eyes. "You look pale. Feeling okay?" "Just tired." But I could see him evaluating my responses, cataloging my behavior for signs of suspicion. The journal had mentioned contingency measures. What would happen if I became too much of a threat to its deception? That night, I pretended to take a sleeping pill while Michael watched, then lay in bed feigning sleep while planning my escape. I couldn't call the police. Who would believe such an impossible story? I couldn't confide in friends or family. How could I prove that my husband had been replaced by something wearing his skin? Near midnight, when Michael's breathing settled into that artificial rhythm I'd learned to recognize, I slipped out of bed and crept downstairs. My car keys were hanging by the front door, exactly where I'd left them. I could be out of the house and driving toward anywhere within minutes. I was reaching for the keys when a hand fell on my shoulder. Going somewhere. I spun around to find Michael standing behind me, but this wasn't the careful imitation I'd been living with. This was the thing from the forest, wearing my husband's face but no longer bothering to hide its true nature. Its movements were too fluid, its expression too predatory, its eyes reflecting the hallway light like mirrors. "I found your journal," I said, backing toward the door. It tilted its head with interest rather than concern. "Did you? How thorough of you." The voice was Michael's, but the inflection was wrong, alien. "I wondered when you'd start exploring. Humans are such curious creatures." "What did you do with him? Where is my real husband?" "He's here," it said, tapping its chest. "His memories, his experiences, his essence, all carefully preserved and integrated. In a way, I am more Michael than Michael ever was. I have access to everything he knew, everything he felt, without the limitations of human biology." I fumbled behind me for the door handle, but it didn't move to stop me. Instead, it smiled with predatory amusement. "You can run if you want," it said conversationally. "I enjoy the chase, but you've seen what I'm capable of, the way this place bends reality to my will. Where exactly do you think you'll go?" That's when I realized the truth that had been staring me in the face. We'd never left the Ruby Mountains. The search and rescue, the drive home, the last 3 months of suburban normalcy, all of it had been elaborate psychological theater designed to keep me calm while this thing perfected its impersonation. I looked around our familiar living room and saw it for what it really was. A stage set, a carefully constructed prison designed to look like safety. Through the windows, instead of our neighborhood, I could see the dark shapes of mountains against a starless sky. "Very good," the thing said, watching understanding dawn on my face. "You're much quicker than most. The confusion usually lasts longer." "Let me go," I whispered, though I knew it was pointless. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, I need you, not just for the memories and emotional context you provide, but for practice. Learning to be human requires ongoing study, and you're such an excellent teacher." It began walking toward me with that unnaturally smooth gait, and I finally found the strength to move. I yanked open the front door and ran into the night, leaving behind the illusion of home, the careful fantasy of normal life. Outside was the forest, eternal and waiting. I ran between dark trees under a sky that held no stars, my feet finding paths that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Behind me, I could hear laughter that sounded like breaking glass, and footsteps that were too light for the distance they covered. I'm still running now, still searching for a way out of this place that exists between spaces, between moments. Sometimes I find other people, hikers and campers who wandered too far into the wild places and never found their way back. We share our stories in whispered voices around fires that burn with impossible colors, warning each other about the things that hunt in the spaces where maps end. The creature that wears Michael's face still calls my name sometimes, echoing through the forest with perfect imitation of love and concern. It's patient. It has all the time in the world to wear me down, to convince me to stop running and accept the comfortable prison it's built. But I know the truth now. I know what waits for anyone who ventures too far into the wild places, the spaces where ancient things still remember how to hunt. I know that some disappearances aren't accidents or crimes, but something far worse. A slow theft of identity and memory. A replacement so perfect that even loved ones never notice the difference. So I keep running, keep searching for the boundary between this nightmare realm and the real world. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe this is the real world, and everything else was the illusion. Maybe I've been running forever, and my memories of suburban life, of marriage, of the woman called Jennifer Williams, are just dreams this place has given me to make the hunting more interesting. But real or not, I won't stop. I won't let it win. And if you're reading this, if somehow this account has made it out of the wilderness and into the world, then please, for the love of everything you hold dear, stay away from the wild places. Stay on the marked trails, camp in established sites, and never, ever trust the kindness of strangers who find you when you're lost. Because in the dark spaces between the maps, things are waiting that know how to wear your face better than you do. And once they've seen you, once they've learned your shape and sound and scent, they'll follow you forever, patient as stone, hungry as winter, wearing the faces of everyone you've ever loved. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Jarbidge wilderness of northeastern Nevada, where the mountains swallow sound and the darkness between the pines seems to breathe. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip. Just me, my college roommate Marcus Reed, and our friend Sarah Martinez from work. We'd all been grinding through another soul-crushing year at the accounting firm in Reno, and Sarah had convinced us we needed to reconnect with nature before we all had complete mental breakdowns. She'd found this spot on some obscure hiking forum, a secluded canyon near the old Jarbidge ghost town, where an abandoned mining trail led to supposedly pristine alpine lakes. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no distractions, Sarah had said, her eyes lighting up with an enthusiasm that seemed forced even then. Just us, the wilderness, and some much-needed perspective. Marcus had been skeptical from the start. He was the practical one among us. Methodical, cautious, the type who read equipment reviews for hours before buying a flashlight. But even he seemed worn down enough by the office politics and endless spreadsheets to agree to the trip. I should have paid more attention to the silence that fell over the ranger station when I mentioned our destination. The elderly ranger, a weathered man with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold too many secrets, had paused for a long moment before stamping our wilderness permit. "You boys stick to the marked trails," he'd said finally, his voice carrying an odd weight. "And don't go wandering off after dark. Things get confused up there when the sun goes down." We'd laughed it off as typical local color. Every remote area had its ghost stories and superstitions. How wrong we were. The drive to the trailhead took us through increasingly desolate country. Highway 93 gave way to smaller roads, then to dirt tracks that seemed to disappear into the sage-covered hills. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that I couldn't quite identify. Sarah drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as we navigated the rutted path to the parking area. She'd been quiet for the last hour, which was unusual for her. Normally, she chattered constantly when she was nervous, filling silence with observations about everything from cloud formations to roadside geology. But as we climbed higher into the mountains, she'd grown increasingly subdued. "You okay?" I asked as we pulled into the small clearing that served as a parking area. "Fine," she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Just focusing on not driving us off a cliff. The trailhead was marked by a simple wooden sign, its paint faded and peeling. Jarbidge Canyon Trail, 4.2 miles to Mary's Lake. Below it, someone had carved additional text that looked much newer. "Turn back while you can." Marcus snorted. Charming, local hospitality. But I noticed Sarah staring at the carving for a long moment, her face pale. We shouldered our packs and started up the trail. The path was well maintained at first, winding through stands of aspen whose golden leaves created a canopy of light overhead. The morning sun filtered through the branches, casting dancing shadows that should have been beautiful but somehow felt menacing. About an hour in, we reached a small clearing where the trail split. The main path continued straight toward the lake, while a fainter track branched off to the right, disappearing into a thick grove of pine trees. "That's not on the map," Marcus said, studying his GPS device with a frown. Sarah had stopped walking entirely, staring down the unmarked trail with an expression I couldn't read. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a sound like distant singing, or maybe just the wind through the trees. But when I strained to listen, there was only silence. "Sarah?" She blinked, seeming to come back to herself. "Sorry, just thought I heard something." We continued on the main trail, but I kept glancing back at that dark grove. Something about it felt wrong. Not just the fact that it wasn't on our map, but something deeper. The way the shadows seemed too thick, too permanent. The way the air around the entrance felt colder despite the warm October sun. The trail climbed steadily through the afternoon. We passed the ruins of an old mining camp. Rusted equipment scattered among the trees. A few collapsed wooden structures slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Sarah insisted on exploring, picking through the debris with an interest that bordered on obsession. "Look at this," she called out, holding up a piece of metal. It was roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate, with symbols carved around the edge that didn't look like any mining equipment markings I'd ever seen. "Probably just some old surveying gear," Marcus said, but he wouldn't touch it when Sarah offered to hand it over. She stared at the metal disc for a long moment, running her fingers over the symbols. "These look older than the mining camp," she murmured. "Much older." That was when I noticed the smell again. That sweet, organic odor I'd caught during the drive up. It was stronger here among the ruins, with an underlying note of decay that made my stomach turn. "We should keep moving," I said. "We want to set up camp before dark." Sarah tucked the metal disc into her pack despite Marcus's protests about leave-no-trace principles. She'd been acting stranger ever since we'd arrived, and I was starting to worry about her. The stress at work had been hitting her particularly hard lately. She'd been pulling all-nighters for weeks, surviving on coffee and energy drinks, talking about deadlines and performance reviews with a manic intensity that wasn't like her. We reached Mary's Lake just as the sun was beginning to set behind the peaks. The lake was beautiful, a perfect mirror of black water surrounded by granite cliffs and pine trees. But something about it felt off. The water was too still, too perfect, and despite the warm day, mist was already beginning to rise from the surface. We set up camp on a small peninsula that jutted into the lake. Marcus pitched his tent with military precision, checking and double-checking his guy lines. Sarah's tent went up more haphazardly. She seemed distracted, constantly glancing toward the tree line as if she expected something to emerge from the shadows. As darkness fell, we built a fire and settled in for what should have been a peaceful evening. The flames danced cheerfully, casting warm light on our faces and pushing back the mountain chill. But the darkness beyond our small circle of light seemed somehow thicker than it should have been, as if it was actively pressing against the firelight. "God, listen to that silence," Marcus said, taking a sip from his camping mug. "It's so quiet, I can hear my heartbeat." He was right. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. No owl hoots, no rustle of small animals in the brush, no splash of fish jumping in the lake. Even the wind had died completely, leaving us in a bubble of perfect, suffocating quiet. Sarah sat cross-legged on her sleeping pad, staring into the fire with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. She hadn't said much since we'd made camp, and she'd barely touched her dinner. "You sure you're okay?" I asked her again. She looked up at me, and for a moment her eyes seemed to reflect the firelight in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of an animal's. "I keep having this feeling," she said slowly, "like I've been here before, but I know I haven't." "Déjà vu," Marcus said. "Happens to me all the time in new places. Something about the landscape triggers a memory you didn't know you had." But Sarah shook her head. "No, it's more than that. I keep thinking about that trail, the one that wasn't on the map. I feel like I'm supposed to go there." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Sarah, that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people lost in the wilderness. We stick to marked trails. Remember?" She nodded, but I could see in her eyes that she wasn't really listening. Something was pulling at her, something I couldn't understand or fight. We turned in early, each retreating to our tents as the fire burned down to glowing coals. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the absolute silence and trying to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes, I'd think I heard something. A footstep, a whisper, the sound of breathing that wasn't coming from either of the other tents. But when I held my breath and strained to listen, there was nothing. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to the sound of a zipper. My watch read 2:17 a.m. I heard soft footsteps moving away from our campsite, heading toward the tree line. "Sarah?" I whispered, but there was no answer. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. The fire had died to barely glowing embers casting almost no light, but in the faint starlight I could see a figure moving across the clearing, Sarah, walking toward the forest with the slow, deliberate pace of a sleepwalker. I should have called out to her, should have woken Marcus, should have done something to stop her, but something about the way she moved, so purposeful, so certain, made me hesitate. And in that moment of hesitation, she disappeared into the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and scrambled out of the tent. "Marcus! Marcus, wake up!" He emerged from his tent, groggy and confused. "What's wrong?" "Sarah's gone. She walked into the forest." We threw on our boots and jackets and followed her trail, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Her footprints were clear in the soft earth leading directly toward the spot where the unmarked trail had branched off from the main path. The forest at night was a different world entirely. Our lights seemed to penetrate only a few feet into the darkness, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. The silence was even more oppressive than it had been at camp. Our footsteps and breathing sounded unnaturally loud, as if the darkness was amplifying every sound. "Sarah!" Marcus called out, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the trees. We followed her trail for what felt like hours, though my watch said only 30 minutes had passed. The unmarked path wound deeper into the forest, climbing steadily toward a saddle between two peaks. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead to block out even the faint starlight. That's when we heard the singing. It was faint at first, just a thread of melody drifting through the trees. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing words in a language I didn't recognize. The tune was haunting, beautiful in a way that made my chest ache with longing for something I couldn't name. "Is that?" Marcus started to ask, but I was already moving toward the sound. The singing grew louder as we climbed, and with it came that sweet, organic smell I'd been noticing all day. Now I could identify it. It was the smell of decay masked by something floral, like perfume sprayed over rotting meat. We reached the source of the singing at the edge of a small meadow. Sarah stood in the center of the clearing, her back to us, still in her pajamas and bare feet despite the cold. She was singing, but the voice coming from her throat didn't sound entirely like her own. It was too perfect, too pure, with harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. Around her feet, the grass was brown and withered, as if her presence was somehow draining the life from the earth. And scattered throughout the meadow were bones. Old bones, yellowed and cracked, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Sarah," I called out softly, not wanting to startle her. She stopped singing and turned around. In the beam of my flashlight, her face was serene, almost beatific, but her eyes were wrong. Too bright, reflecting light like an animal's, and when she smiled at us I saw that her teeth had grown longer, sharper. "I remember now," she said, and her voice carried the same unnatural harmonics as her singing. "I remember what this place is, what I am." Marcus grabbed my arm. "Dan, we need to get out of here, now." But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the wrongness of Sarah's face, by the way the shadows seemed to bend around her like she was somehow more real than the rest of the world. "The hunger," she continued, taking a step toward us. "It's been growing for so long. I thought it was just stress, just the pressure at work, but it's been calling me here, hasn't it? To where it all began." That's when I noticed the metal disc from the mining camp hanging around her neck, glinting in the flashlight beam. But now I could see what those symbols really were. Not mining equipment markings, but something far older, something that predated human settlement in these mountains by centuries. "Sarah, you're not making sense," I said, though every instinct was screaming at me to run. "You're sick. Hypothermia can cause confusion, hallucinations." Her laugh cut me off, a sound like wind chimes made of bones. "I'm not sick, Daniel. I'm finally awake. Do you know what a wendigo is?" The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard the stories, of course, the Native American legends about cannibalistic creatures that had once been human, driven mad by hunger and isolation until they transformed into something else entirely. But those were just stories. "The first one was a trapper," Sarah continued, walking slowly toward us. 1847. Got snowed in for the winter in this very canyon. Ran out of food by February. By March, he was eating his own fingers. By April. She gestured to the bones scattered around the meadow. "Well, spring is a long way off when you're that hungry." Marcus was pulling at my arm, trying to drag me away, but I felt rooted to the spot. This couldn't be happening. People didn't transform into mythological creatures. This was the 21st century. "The mining company found his camp in 1863, Sarah went on. "What was left of it? They tried to cleanse the area, thought they could bury the curse with silver and iron and Christian prayers. But the hunger doesn't die, Daniel. It just waits." She was close enough now that I could see the details of her transformation. Her fingernails had grown into claws, yellowed and sharp. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface. Most horrifying of all were her eyes, still recognizably Sarah's, but with something else looking out from behind them, something ancient and eternally starving. "I felt it the moment we arrived," she said, reaching out with one clawed hand to stroke my cheek. Her touch was ice cold. The calling, the awakening, all those late nights at the office, all that stress and hunger and desperation, it was preparing me, making me ready. That broke the spell. I stumbled backward, finally able to move, and Marcus and I turned and ran. Behind us, Sarah's laughter followed through the trees, no longer entirely human. And beneath it, I could hear her singing again. That beautiful, terrible melody that seemed to burrow into my brain and make me want to turn around, to go back to her, to let her show me what she'd learned about hunger. We crashed through the forest, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, creating a strobe effect that made the trees seem to dance and reach for us with gnarled fingers. Behind us, I could hear Sarah following. Not running, but walking with that same deliberate pace, as if she knew exactly where we would go. "The camp," Marcus gasped. "Get to the camp and we'll figure out what to do." But when we reached our campsite, we found it destroyed. Our tents had been shredded, our supplies scattered and spoiled. The food was rotting as if it had been sitting in the heat for weeks, crawling with maggots that shouldn't exist in October temperatures. Our backpacks were gone, along with our car keys. Worst of all, the fire was burning again. Not the warm, comforting campfire we'd built, but something else entirely. The flames were wrong colors, blues and greens that cast sickly light and seemed to move independently of any wind. And in the heart of the fire, something was moving. Shapes that looked almost like dancing figures, or maybe writhing bodies. "What the hell is happening?" Marcus whispered. That's when Sarah's voice drifted through the trees, much closer than it should have been. She was singing again, but now there were other voices joining in, a chorus of the lost and hungry, all singing that same haunting melody. "The car," I said. "We have to get to the car." But even as I said it, I knew it was hopeless. The trail back to the parking area was 4 miles of rough terrain in complete darkness, and Sarah knew these mountains now in a way we never could. Still, we had to try. We started down the trail, moving as quickly as we dared in the dark. My flashlight battery was already getting weak, the beam growing dimmer with each step. Behind us, the singing continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. About halfway down, we reached the mining ruins again. In the darkness, they looked different. More complete, somehow. as if the collapsed buildings had rebuilt themselves when no one was looking. Lights flickered in the windows and I could see figures moving inside. "That's impossible," Marcus breathed. "Those buildings were falling down this afternoon." But impossible or not, the ruins were alive with activity. And as we crept past, trying to stay hidden in the shadows, I caught glimpses of the figures inside. They were people, or had been once. Miners in old-fashioned clothes, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow, and all of them were eating, tearing into meat with their hands and teeth, but never seeming satisfied. One of them looked up and saw us through a broken window. He smiled, and his teeth were stained dark with blood. Then he pointed in our direction and said something in a language that sounded like wind through dead leaves. We ran again. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, winding through terrain that I didn't remember from our hike up. The trees were different, older and more twisted, their branches forming shapes that looked disturbingly like reaching hands or screaming faces. And always, there was the singing behind us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw the parking area ahead. My car sat exactly where we'd left it, looking blessedly normal and real in the starlight. But as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The car was covered in frost, despite the mild October temperature. Ice crystals glittered on the windshield and body panels, and when I touched the door handle, it was so cold it burned my fingers. "Keys," Marcus said urgently. "Tell me you have spare keys." I kept a magnetic key holder under the rear bumper for emergencies. With numb fingers, I fumbled for it, praying it would still be there. Found it, pulled out the key with shaking hands. The engine turned over reluctantly, coughing and sputtering as if it had been sitting in the cold for months instead of hours. But it started, and I threw it into reverse, not caring about the ice on the windshield. As we backed out of the parking space, Sarah emerged from the tree line. She looked completely transformed now. Tall and emaciated, her limbs unnaturally long, her face a grotesque parody of human features. But it was still her eyes looking at us, still my friend trapped inside that nightmare. She didn't try to stop us, just stood there watching as we drove away. But in the rearview mirror, I saw her raise one clawed hand and wave goodbye. And I swear I could hear her singing over the sound of the engine, that haunting melody that would follow me for the rest of my life. We drove in silence until we reached the main highway, neither of us wanting to speak about what we'd seen. It wasn't until we were back in Reno, sitting in a 24-hour diner surrounded by fluorescent lights and the comfortable sounds of civilization, that we tried to make sense of it. "We should call the police," Marcus said for the third time. "Report her missing." "And tell them what? That our friend turned into a wendigo?" "We tell them she had a psychological break. Hypothermia-induced psychosis. Something believable." But I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever had happened to Sarah in those mountains, whatever she'd become, it was beyond the reach of search and rescue teams. The hunger that had claimed her was older than the mountains themselves, and it would never let her go. I did call the police eventually. Told them our friend had wandered off during the night and that we'd been unable to find her. A search team went up to Mary's Lake 3 days later, but they found no trace of our campsite, no evidence that we'd ever been there. According to their report, the area had been undisturbed for months. They did find something else, though. The search leader mentioned it almost casually in his final report, an old mining claim from the 1860s, abandoned after several workers disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The company records mentioned unusual phenomena and evidence of cannibalistic activity before the site was sealed and forgotten. Marcus moved back to Chicago a month later. We'd agreed never to talk about what happened, but I could see it eating at him every time we tried to maintain a normal conversation. The last time I saw him, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in a few weeks. I stayed in Reno, but I changed jobs, changed apartments, changed everything I could about my life. I thought distance and time might help me forget, might let me convince myself that it had all been some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But every night when I close my eyes, I hear that singing. that beautiful, terrible melody that Sarah learned in the darkness between the trees. And sometimes when the wind is right and the moon is dark, I think I can hear her calling my name, inviting me to come back to the mountains, to learn what she learned about hunger and transformation. The doctors say it's trauma-induced auditory hallucinations. They've given me pills and therapy and coping strategies. But I know better. I know that somewhere in the Jarbidge wilderness, my friend is still singing, still waiting, still hungry for something that can never be satisfied. And I know that one day, when the pressures of this normal life become too much to bear, when the hunger that lives inside all of us grows too strong to ignore, I'll hear that calling clearly enough to follow it home. The wendigo doesn't just claim its victims, you see. It plants seeds in everyone who encounters it, tiny fragments of its endless hunger that grow and spread like cancer. I can feel mine growing stronger every day, whispering to me about the freedom that waits in those dark mountains, about the peace that comes with finally giving in to what we really are. Sometimes I catch myself humming Sarah's melody without realizing it. And sometimes, late at night when I think no one is listening, I find myself singing along. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 31 years old. This happened in the Ruby Mountains of northeastern Nevada, in a place so remote that our cell phones hadn't shown a single bar for 3 days. The invitation came from my college roommate, Daniel Lopez. We'd lost touch after graduation. Life, careers, the usual drift that happens when you're building your 20s. But when he called me that October, his voice carried an excitement I remembered from our shared adventures in school. "Mike, you've got to see this place," he said, and I could hear wind whistling through the phone. "I've been living off-grid for 6 months now, up in the Rubies. There's this old mining cabin I've been fixing up. You should come visit. Bring your gear, we'll do some real camping like the old days." I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why someone with a promising career in software engineering would suddenly disappear into the Nevada wilderness. But the stress of my own job, the endless cycle of meetings and deadlines, made his offer sound like salvation. 3 weeks later, I was driving my Jeep up a barely there dirt road, following GPS coordinates Danny had texted me. The last town I'd passed through was Lemuel, population maybe 150, and that felt like a metropolis compared to where I was heading. The road got progressively worse, winding through juniper and mountain mahogany, climbing toward peaks that scraped the belly of gray October clouds. I found Danny's camp just as the sun was setting behind the western ridges. The old mining cabin sat in a depression between 2 hills, its tin roof patched with tarps and mismatched metal sheeting. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and I could see the warm glow of lanterns through grimy windows. My headlights picked out Danny's figure emerging from the cabin, and I felt a surge of the old camaraderie. But when I climbed out of the Jeep and really looked at him, my smile faltered. Danny had always been lean, but now he looked gaunt. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes set deep in dark sockets. His smile seemed too wide, showing too many teeth. "Mike!" He grabbed me in a bear hug that felt all bones and sinew. "Jesus, it's good to see you. How was the drive?" "Long," I said, pulling back to study his face. "Danny, you look. Are you eating enough up here?" His laugh had a strange, brittle quality. "The mountains change you, man. Strip away all the unnecessary stuff. You'll see." He gestured toward the cabin. "Come on, let's get you settled. We've got 3 days to really explore this place." The cabin's interior was sparse but functional. Danny had clearly put work into it. The floor was swept clean, there was a wood stove throwing heat, and he'd rigged up a surprisingly sophisticated solar battery system for lights. But something felt off about the space. Maybe it was the way shadows seemed to pool in the corners despite the lanterns, or how the single window facing east was covered with what looked like old newspaper. "Why the newspaper?" I asked, nodding toward the window. Danny followed my gaze and his expression flickered. "Condensation issues," he said quickly. "The temperature differential causes problems. "You hungry? I've got stew going." The stew was good, rich and gamey, though I couldn't identify the meat. Danny explained he'd been hunting to supplement his supplies, getting to know the local ecosystem. As we ate, he talked about his new life with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He'd abandoned his old career, he said, because he'd realized how poisoned civilization had become. Out here, he could think clearly. Out here, he could become what he was meant to be. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. In the lamplight, his eyes seemed to reflect the flame like an animal's. "You'll understand once you've been here a few days. The mountains have a way of showing you the truth." That first night, I slept fitfully in my sleeping bag on the cabin's floor. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, broken only by the settling of the cabin's old timbers and the distant cry of what might have been a coyote. But the sound was wrong somehow. Too long, too mournful, carrying a note that made my skin crawl. I woke once in the deep of night to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I lay still, listening, but Danny's breathing from his bed didn't change rhythm. When I finally worked up the courage to peer through a gap in the newspaper covering the window, I saw nothing but darkness and the faint gleam of my Jeep under starlight. The next morning, Danny was already up and dressed when I emerged from my sleeping bag. He'd prepared coffee and what he called trail bread, dense, nutty loaves that tasted better than they looked. "Today, we're hiking up to Lamoille Canyon," he announced. "There's something I want to show you." The hike was beautiful and brutal. We climbed through aspen groves painted gold by autumn, their leaves whispering in the thin mountain air. Danny set a punishing pace, and despite my regular gym routine, I found myself struggling to keep up. He moved through the terrain like he'd been born to it, picking roots through the rocky ground with an instinctive ease. "You're in good shape," I panted during one of our rare rest stops. He looked back at me with that too-wide smile. "The mountain teaches you, shows you what your body can really do." We'd been hiking for about 4 hours when Danny suddenly stopped. We were in a grove of ancient pines, their trunks thick enough that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with something that made my scalp prickle. "This is it," Danny said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "This is where it happened." Where what happened? Instead of answering, he led me to a clearing in the center of the grove. The ground was bare earth, packed hard as concrete. At the center of the clearing was a ring of stones arranged in a rough circle. Within the circle, the earth was dark, not with soil, but with something that looked disturbingly like old blood. "Danny," I said, backing away from the circle. "What is this place?" He was staring at the stones with an expression I'd never seen before. Hungry, reverent, almost sexual in its intensity. "The Shoshone called them the Bone Eaters," he said. "They warned people away from this part of the mountains, said something lived here that was always hungry, always hunting." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're talking about folklore, right? Legend?" Danny's head turned toward me, and for a moment his face looked like a stranger's. "There are more things in these mountains than your philosophy ever dreamed of, Mike." We hiked back in relative silence, but I noticed Danny kept looking over his shoulder. Not at me, at something behind us, following in our wake. I never saw anything when I turned to look, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each mile. That evening, Danny prepared another stew. This time, I paid more attention to the meat. It was red and stringy with a gamey flavor that reminded me of venison, but somehow more intense. When I asked what kind of game it was, Danny just smiled. "Mountain provides," he said. I was washing my bowl in the basin Danny had set up outside when I noticed the bones. A pile of them, bleached white, sitting beside the cabin where I hadn't seen them before. They were too large to be rabbit or squirrel, too small to be elk or deer. The proportions were wrong for any animal I knew. "Danny," I called. What are these bones from?" He appeared beside me so suddenly I jumped. I hadn't heard him come out of the cabin. "Dinner," he said simply, and the way he said it made me drop the bowl. I slept even worse that second night. The circling footsteps returned, closer this time, and with them came a smell, sweet and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. I lay in my sleeping bag with my eyes closed, trying to convince myself it was my imagination, but the smell grew stronger until I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. When I woke the next morning, Danny was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, unzipped from the inside, just like the stories I'd heard around campfires. His boots were missing, but his jacket hung on its peg by the door. I called his name, searched around the cabin, even walked partway up the trail we'd taken the day before. Nothing. I was starting to panic when I heard whistling coming from the direction of the old mine shaft about a quarter-mile east of the cabin. The tune was familiar, something Danny used to whistle when we were studying late into the night in college. A Beatles song, "Here Comes the Sun." I found him sitting on a fallen log near the mine entrance, still whistling. He looked up when I approached, and his smile was bright and normal and perfectly Danny. "There you are," he said. "I was starting to worry. Sleep well." "Where were you?" I demanded. "I woke up, and you were gone." He looked genuinely confused. "I went for a walk, couldn't sleep. You know how it is." He stood and stretched, and I noticed his clothes were filthy, stained with something dark. "Come on, let's get some breakfast. I'm starving." But as we walked back to the cabin, I noticed things that made my stomach clench. Danny's walk was different, more of a stalk, with his head held at an odd angle. He kept sniffing the air like an animal testing for scent, and when he smiled at something I said, I saw that his teeth looked different, sharper. "Danny," I said carefully, "are you feeling all right?" He stopped walking and turned to face me. For a moment, his expression was completely blank, as if he was looking at me without recognition. Then the smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Never better," he said. "Why?" I made an excuse about needing to check my Jeep's tire pressure and spent the morning examining my vehicle. Everything seemed fine, but I found myself checking the gas gauge obsessively. 3/4 full, enough to get back to Lemoyle if I needed to leave quickly. When I returned to the cabin, Danny was preparing lunch, more of that strange meat, this time roasted over the fire. The smell made my mouth water despite my growing unease. "We should head back to that grove today," Danny said, not looking up from his cooking. "There's more I want to show you." "I think I've seen enough," I said. His head turned toward me with a mechanical precision that reminded me of an owl. "But Mike, you haven't seen the best part yet. You haven't seen what happens after dark." Something in his tone made me take a step back. "I think I might head home today, actually. I've got work Monday." "No." The word came out sharp and flat. "You can't leave yet. You haven't learned what I learned." I was reaching for my car keys when Danny moved. He was across the cabin before I could blink, his hand clamping down on my wrist with a strength that made my bones grind together. "Danny, let go." His grip tightened, and I felt something wet and warm dripping onto my hand. When I looked down, I saw that his fingernails had grown into claws, and they were digging into my skin. "You need to understand," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. "The hunger is so pure, Mike, so clean. It strips away all the lies, all the pretense. When you're hungry enough, you become what you really are." I drove my knee up into his solar plexus as hard as I could. He doubled over with a sound like steam escaping, and I bolted for the door. My keys were in my pocket, and the Jeep was only 20 yards away. If I could just... The world exploded into white pain as something struck me across the back of the head. I hit the ground hard, tasting blood and pine needles. When my vision cleared, Danny was standing over me, but it wasn't Danny anymore. His proportions were wrong, stretched and elongated like a photograph that had been pulled at the corners. His arms reached nearly to his knees, ending in hands that looked more like talons. His face was Danny's face, but the skin was too pale, too tight, pulled back to reveal too many teeth, all of them sharp. His eyes were black from lid to lid, reflecting the afternoon light like obsidian. "I was trying to do this the easy way," he said, and his voice was a whistle of wind through dead branches. "I wanted you to choose, but the hunger doesn't wait." I tried to crawl toward the jeep, but he stepped on my ankle, and I felt bones crack. The pain was indescribable, but it also cleared my head. I rolled onto my back and looked up at the thing that had been my friend. "What did you do with Danny?" It cocked its head. "I am Danny. I'm just more than I was. The thing in the grove, it taught me, showed me how to shed the weak parts. The Bone Eater. Such a crude name. I prefer to think of it as evolution." The thing that wasn't Danny knelt beside me. Up close, I could see that its skin was covered in fine, dark hair, and its breath smelled like rotting meat. "You'll understand once you're chosen. Once you've tasted what I've tasted." It grabbed my shoulders and hauled me upright. My broken ankle sent lightning bolts of agony up my leg, but I forced myself to stay conscious. The creature, I couldn't think of it as Danny anymore, dragged me toward the trees. "The grove is where it happens," it explained conversationally, "where the transformation completes. You'll fight it at first, but then you'll realize how good it feels to stop pretending to be human." We were halfway to the tree line when I remembered the survival knife on my belt. The creature was strong, impossibly strong, but it was focused on dragging me forward rather than watching my hands. I managed to work the knife free just as we entered the shadow of the pines. The first stab went between its ribs, and the creature screamed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a mountain lion's shriek. Black blood spurted from the wound, hissing where it hit the pine needles. The thing dropped me and staggered backward, looking down at the knife handle protruding from its side. "That hurt," it said, sounding genuinely surprised. I was already moving, crawling as fast as I could toward a fallen log I could use for cover. Behind me, I heard the sick sound of the creature pulling the knife from its flesh, then its footsteps as it began to stalk me. You can't run from what you are. "Mike," it called, "the hunger is in all of us. I'm just helping you find it." The fallen log provided temporary shelter, but I knew it wouldn't last long. My ankle was useless, my head was spinning from blood loss, and the creature was between me and any possible escape route. But as I huddled behind the rotting wood, I noticed something that gave me hope. The grove Danny had shown me the day before was visible through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, and scattered around it, like offerings left by previous victims, were bones. Not just animal bones. Some of them were clearly human. Ribs, skulls, the delicate bones of hands and feet. All of them picked clean and bleached white by time and weather. But more importantly, I could see something else among the bones. The metallic glint of equipment, camping gear, hunting rifles, even what looked like the remains of a motorcycle. Other people had been here. Other people had faced what I was facing, which meant some of them might have been prepared. I heard the creature moving around the log, testing for an opening. Its breathing had changed, becoming more labored and wet-sounding. The knife wound was affecting it more than it wanted to admit. "Come out, Mike," it wheezed. "Let's finish this. I promise it won't hurt for long." Instead of answering, I began crawling toward the grove, using every piece of cover I could find. The creature's hearing was clearly enhanced, but its attention seemed focused on the area around the log. I made it 20 yards before it realized I'd moved. "Clever," it said, and I could hear the smile in its voice. "But you're only delaying the inevitable." The grove was worse up close. The smell of old death was overwhelming, and the ground was soft with decomposed organic matter. But among the scattered belongings of previous victims, I found what I was looking for: a hunting rifle, still in decent condition with a box of ammunition scattered nearby. I'd learned to shoot as a kid, and muscle memory took over as I loaded the rifle with shaking hands. The creature emerged from the tree line just as I chambered the first round. "Oh," it said, seeing the rifle. "You think that will stop me?" I put the first shot center mass and the creature staggered but didn't go down. The second shot took it in the shoulder, spinning it around. The third shot, aimed at its head, missed by inches as it dove for cover behind one of the standing stones. "You're only making me angry," it screamed, and its voice had lost all pretense of humanity. It was the sound of wind through a cave, of ice cracking under pressure. I tried to keep the rifle trained on its position, but my hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll, and I knew I only had a few more minutes of consciousness left. The creature appeared on my left, moving faster than anything its size should be able to move. I swung the rifle around and fired, but the shot went wide. Its claws raked across my chest, shredding my jacket and the skin beneath. I fell backward and the rifle skittered away across the bloody ground. "Now," the creature panted, looming over me. "Now you'll understand." It reached down with both hands, and I saw that its fingernails had grown even longer, curved like scythes. But as it leaned forward, its weight shifted onto its wounded side, and it stumbled slightly. That stumble saved my life. Instead of tearing out my throat as intended, its claws only scored deep furrows across my collarbone. I rolled away, screaming, and my hand closed around something hard and metallic. A camp hatchet, probably dropped by some long-dead hiker. The creature was recovering its balance when I swung the hatchet with everything I had left. The blade bit deep into its ankle, the same ankle that had been shot, and this time the scream that came from its throat was pure agony. It toppled sideways, and I followed it down, raising the hatchet again. The second blow caught it across the face, opening a gash from forehead to jaw. Black blood sprayed across the stone circle, hissing and smoking where it landed. "Mike!" it gasped, and for a moment its voice was almost human again. "Mike, please, it's still me in here. Danny, your friend." I hesitated, and that hesitation almost killed me. The creature's hand shot out and wrapped around my throat, cutting off my air. Its grip was like a steel cable, and I felt my vision starting to tunnel. But as consciousness faded, I heard something that gave me hope. The distant sound of helicopter rotors. The grip on my throat loosened slightly, and the creature's head turned toward the sound. "No," it whispered. "Not yet. I'm not ready." I used its distraction to drive the hatchet into its wrist. The creature released me with another shriek, and I rolled away, gasping for air. The helicopter sound was getting closer, and I could see a searchlight sweeping through the trees. "You called them," the creature accused, its voice thick with pain and fury. "You found a way to call for help." I hadn't, but I wasn't about to correct it. Instead, I used the standing stones to pull myself upright and began waving at the approaching helicopter. The searchlight found me immediately, bathing the grove in harsh white light. The creature hissed and scrambled toward the tree line, moving like a wounded animal. In the helicopter's spotlight, I could see how much damage I'd done. Its left arm hung useless at its side, its face was a mask of black blood, and it was leaving a trail of dark fluid as it moved. "This isn't over, Mike," it called as it disappeared into the forest. "The hunger doesn't die. It just waits." The helicopter touched down in the clearing beyond the grove, and I could see figures in rescue gear running toward me. But I kept my eyes on the tree line, watching for any sign of movement. Even as the paramedics worked on me, even as they loaded me into the helicopter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the shadows between the pines. They found Danny's body 3 days later, buried in a shallow grave near the mine shaft. The coroner said he'd been dead for at least 2 weeks, killed by something with very sharp claws. They never found what had attacked me in the grove, despite extensive searches with dogs and thermal imaging. The official report listed my attacker as an unknown large predator, possibly a mountain lion affected by disease. I didn't correct them. Who would believe the truth? But I know what I saw. I know what Danny became, and I know it's still out there somewhere in the Ruby Mountains, waiting for the next lonely hiker or camper to wander too far from civilization. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment back in the city, I hear whistling outside my window. "Here Comes the Sun," played just slightly off-key, with too many high notes that human lips shouldn't be able to produce. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I notice things that make my blood run cold. My teeth seem a little sharper. My appetite has grown stronger, especially for rare meat. And when I'm very hungry, when I haven't eaten for too long, I catch myself staring at the people around me and wondering what they might taste like. "The hunger doesn't die," Danny had said. "It just waits." I'm beginning to understand what he meant. My name is James Anderson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Jarbidge Wilderness of northern Nevada, in a place where the mountains scrape the sky and civilization feels like a distant memory. I should have listened to the locals in Elko when they warned us about the Jarbidge. Should have paid attention when the gas station attendant's face went pale at the mention of our destination. Should have turned around when that old Shoshone man grabbed my arm and whispered, "Some things in those mountains ain't meant to be found, son." But I didn't listen. None of us did. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip. Myself, my college roommate Marcus Chen, and our friend David Lopez from work. We'd been planning this Nevada wilderness adventure for months, needing an escape from our suffocating corporate jobs in Reno. The Jarbidge Wilderness area seemed perfect. 113,000 acres of untouched mountainous terrain, the most remote wilderness in Nevada, where you could hike for days without seeing another soul. That remoteness should have been our first warning. We drove up from Reno on a Friday morning in October, the aspen leaves already turning gold against the stark granite peaks. The 2-hour drive to the trailhead took us through increasingly desolate country, past abandoned mining claims and ghost towns that time had forgotten. Cell service died somewhere around Mountain City, our phones becoming expensive paperweights. "Just what we need," Marcus said, holding his iPhone up futilely. "A real digital detox." David laughed from the passenger seat, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses. "Come on, man. When's the last time you went 3 days without checking email? This'll be good for us." I wish I could go back to that moment, to the easy camaraderie, the excitement of adventure ahead, before I knew what David would become. The Jarbidge guard station was unmanned when we arrived to pick up our wilderness permits. A handwritten note was taped to the door. "Due to staff shortage, self-register for backcountry permits. Emergency contact information available inside." The building was unlocked, dusty, and felt abandoned. An old logbook sat open on a wooden desk, the last entry dated 3 weeks prior. "Friendly place," Marcus muttered, signing us in. We shouldered our packs and hit the trail around noon, following the Jarbidge River toward the high country. The path was well maintained at first, winding through stands of mountain mahogany and Utah juniper. But as we climbed higher, the trail became fainter, more overgrown. Ancient blazes on trees looked weathered and unclear. By evening, we'd reached our planned campsite near Cougar Lake, a pristine alpine pond nestled in a cirque of granite walls. The setting sun painted the peaks blood red, and shadows began pooling in the valleys like dark water. We set up our tents in a meadow beside the lake, built a fire ring from loose stones, and settled in for what we expected to be a perfect wilderness evening. That's when the first strange thing happened. David had gone to gather firewood while Marcus and I prepared dinner. He returned 20 minutes later with an armload of dead branches, but something was off. He moved differently, too quietly, too deliberately. When he smiled at us, it lasted several seconds too long, his eyes not quite focused on our faces. "You okay, man?" I asked. "Fine," he said simply. Nothing more. David had always been the chatterbox of our group, constantly cracking jokes or launching into detailed explanations of whatever random topic caught his interest. This monosyllabic response was completely unlike him. Marcus caught my eye across the fire pit, his expression questioning. I shrugged it off. David was probably just tired from the hike. We cooked our freeze-dried meals over the camp stove and tried to get a fire going as darkness fell. But the wood wouldn't catch properly, no matter how we arranged it. The flames would flicker to life, burn weakly for a few minutes, then die out completely. Even with plenty of tinder and kindling, we couldn't maintain a decent fire. "Weird," Marcus said, striking another match. "This wood should burn fine." David sat on a log beside us, staring into the failed fire pit with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He hadn't touched his food, hadn't spoken since his brief response earlier. In the dying light, his face looked different somehow, the angles sharper, the shadows deeper. "David," I said, "you feeling all right?" He turned to look at me then, and for just a moment, I could have sworn his eyes reflected the faint starlight like an animal's. But when I blinked and looked again, they were normal. "I'm fine, James," he said in that same flat tone. We gave up on the fire and retreated to our tents as full darkness settled over the mountains. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the absolute silence of the wilderness. No traffic, no electric hum, no human sounds at all. Just the faint whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of an owl. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of Marcus calling my name. "James! James! Wake up!" I unzipped my tent and crawled out to find Marcus standing by the cold fire pit, his headlamp cutting a weak beam through the darkness. "What's wrong?" I asked. "David's gone." I looked toward David's tent and saw it was empty. The sleeping bag unzipped from the inside and pulled back. His boots were missing from the entrance. "Maybe he went to take a leak," I suggested, though something cold was already forming in my stomach. "I've been calling for him for 10 minutes, Marcus said. "He's not answering." We spent the next hour searching the immediate area with our flashlights, calling David's name into the darkness. The sound seemed to be swallowed by the mountains, producing no echo, no response. It was as if the wilderness had absorbed him completely. "We should wait until morning," I finally said. "He couldn't have gone far in the dark. Maybe he got turned around and found shelter somewhere." But I didn't believe it. David was an experienced hiker, not the type to wander off in unfamiliar terrain after dark. And there was something else. Something I didn't want to admit even to myself. When we'd searched near his tent, I'd noticed footprints in the soft earth leading away from our camp. They were definitely David's boots, but the prints looked wrong somehow. Too deep, too far apart, as if he'd been walking differently. We barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound made us jump. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote that seemed to go on far too long. Dawn brought no relief. We packed up camp and began a systematic search of the area, expanding our radius as the morning wore on. The weather had turned overnight. Thick clouds obscured the peaks and a cold wind carried the promise of snow. Our GPS units, which had worked fine the day before, now showed our location as a blank area on the map. No topographical features, no trail markers, just empty space. "That's impossible," Marcus said, shaking his GPS unit. "This thing has the entire state mapped." My own unit showed the same thing. According to the satellite navigation, we were standing in the middle of nowhere, in a place that didn't exist on any map. Around noon, we heard David calling, "Help! Over here!" The voice came from somewhere up the slope, beyond a thick stand of bristlecone pines. Marcus and I looked at each other with relief and terror in equal measure. "David!" I shouted back. "Where are you?" "Down here! I'm hurt!" We crashed through the undergrowth following his voice. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches catching at our clothes and packs. The temperature was dropping steadily, and ice was beginning to form on the rocks. We found him in a small clearing, sitting with his back against a dead tree. He was wearing the same clothes from the night before, but they were somehow clean. No dirt, no tears, no sign that he'd spent hours wandering through the wilderness. His face was pale, almost gray, and when he smiled at us, I noticed his teeth looked different, sharper. "Thank God you found me," he said, but his voice carried no emotion, no relief. I got lost in the dark, fell down a ravine. Are you hurt? Marcus asked, rushing to his side. Just some bruises. I'm fine now. But he wasn't fine. Everything about David screamed wrongness. The way he moved as he stood up, too fluid, too graceful. The way his eyes seemed to look through us rather than at us. The complete absence of any injury despite claiming to have fallen down a ravine. And there was something else. The clearing where we'd found him was wrong too. Despite being completely enclosed by dense forest, no snow was falling here. The ground was bare, dark earth, and I could smell something underneath the pine scent, something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. We should head back to the trail, I said, fighting the urge to run. Get you checked out properly. David nodded, shouldering his pack with movements that were too quick, too precise. Good idea. The hike back to our original campsite took twice as long as it should have. The trail seemed to shift around us, familiar landmarks appearing in the wrong places. Twice we came to forks in the path that hadn't been there before. Our compasses spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. By the time we reached Cougar Lake, the snow was falling heavily. Large, wet flakes that stuck to everything and quickly began accumulating. The temperature had plummeted at least 20 degrees since morning. We need to get down to lower elevation, Marcus said, checking his watch. This storm's getting bad. I agreed, but as we packed our gear, I kept watching David out of the corner of my eye. He moved through the tasks of breaking camp with mechanical efficiency, never speaking unless directly asked a question, and his answers were always the same brief, emotionless responses. The strangest thing was his reaction to the cold. Marcus and I were bundling up in layers, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air. But David seemed completely unaffected. He wore only a light fleece jacket, and I never saw him shiver once. We started down the trail as the storm intensified. The snow was coming down so hard now that visibility was reduced to maybe 20 feet. The path became treacherous, slick with ice and hidden rocks. Marcus and I stumbled and slipped constantly, but David moved with sure-footed confidence, as if he could see perfectly in the whiteout conditions. "How much farther to the trailhead?" Marcus shouted over the wind. I checked my GPS again. Still nothing. Just that blank, empty space where we apparently didn't exist. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Maybe 3 miles?" But the trail kept going down, switchbacking through terrain I didn't recognize. We should have reached familiar landmarks by now. The wooden bridge over Jarbidge Creek, the old mining cabin, the junction with the main trail. Instead, we descended through forest that grew denser and darker with each turn. The trees here were wrong. Twisted pines with needles that looked almost black, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Between them, I caught glimpses of other shapes moving in the storm, shadow forms that vanished when I tried to focus on them. "James," Marcus called from behind me, "something's wrong with the snow." I stopped and looked back. In the few seconds since Marcus had passed a particular spot on the trail, his footprints had filled with snow, but not the white snow that was falling. This snow was dark, almost gray, and it gave off a smell like copper pennies. "What the hell?" I muttered. David, who was walking point, turned back to look at us. In the dim light filtering through the storm, his face appeared gaunt, hollow-cheeked. When he smiled, I was certain I saw too many teeth. "Just a little farther," he said. "I know a shortcut." Every instinct I had screamed at me not to follow him. But what choice did we have? We were lost in a blizzard, with no GPS, no cell service, and no idea where we were. David, whatever was wrong with him, seemed to know the way. He led us off the main trail onto a barely visible path that wound between massive granite boulders. The wind died away here, and the silence was profound. No sound of snow falling, no creak of trees in the wind. Just our breathing and the crunch of our boots on the ground. The path opened into a canyon I was certain hadn't been on any of our maps. The walls rose steeply on either side, dark stone that seemed to absorb what little light remained. At the far end, I could see structures, old buildings partially collapsed and overgrown with dead vegetation. "What is this place?" Marcus whispered. David was already walking toward the buildings. "An old mining camp," he called back. "We can wait out the storm here." But as we got closer, I could see these weren't mining buildings. They were older, much older, built from fitted stone blocks in a style I didn't recognize. Symbols were carved into the walls, spirals and angular shapes that hurt to look at directly. "This doesn't look right," I said to Marcus. "We should turn back." But when I turned around, the path we'd followed was gone. Instead of the narrow canyon entrance, there was only solid rock wall, as if the passage had sealed itself behind us. Marcus saw it too. His face went white. "James, how is that possible?" I didn't have an answer. Nothing about this made sense. The buildings, the canyon, the impossible geography, all of it defied rational explanation. David was standing in front of the largest structure, a building that might once have been a church or meeting hall. The wooden door was open and darkness spilled out like liquid. "Come on," he called. "It's warm inside." That's when I knew for certain that whatever was walking around in David's body wasn't David anymore. The real David Lopez was terrified of enclosed spaces, had been ever since getting trapped in a cave during a college geology trip. He would never voluntarily enter a dark, unfamiliar building. "No," I said firmly, "we're not going in there." David turned to face us fully, and in the pale light, I could finally see what he'd become. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible eye. When he smiled, his mouth opened too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "You will come inside," he said, and his voice was different now, layered as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "The others are waiting." Marcus grabbed my arm. "Others?" From inside the building came sounds, shuffling footsteps, whispered voices, and something else. Sobbing. Someone was crying in there, the sound echoing off stone walls. The thing wearing David's face took a step toward us. "The hunger is so strong," it said. "We've been alone here so long, but now we have friends. Now we can feed." I pulled Marcus backward, away from the building, but there was nowhere to go. The canyon walls rose straight up, unclimbable. Behind us was solid rock. The only way out was through the building, past whatever David had become. "What do you want?" I shouted. It tilted its head, considering. "To wear your skin, to taste your memories, to walk in the world above and bring others back to feed the family." The family. I thought of the crying voice inside the building and felt sick. How many people had been lured here over the years? How many hikers and campers had simply vanished in these mountains? Their disappearances written off as accidents or people getting lost? The thing that had been David was moving closer now, its movements becoming less human with each step. Its arms were too long, its fingers stretched into claws. The skin of its face was starting to shift and ripple as if something underneath was trying to break free. "James," Marcus whispered. "The rocks, above the door." I looked where he was pointing and saw that one of the stone blocks above the entrance was loose, held in place by ancient mortar that was crumbling away. It was maybe 50 pounds of granite, positioned directly over where the thing would be standing if it kept advancing. "When I say go, throw something at that stone," I whispered back. I pulled my water bottle from my pack and waited. The creature was 10 feet away now, close enough that I could smell it. The sickly sweet stench of decomposition mixed with something else, something wild and predatory. "Go!" I hurled the water bottle as hard as I could at the loose stone. The impact was just enough to dislodge it completely. 50 pounds of granite crashed down, striking the creature directly on the head and shoulders. The thing that had been David shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the cry of a wounded animal. It collapsed under the stone, black fluid oozing from its crushed skull. But even as we watched, it was trying to move, trying to pull itself free. "The building," Marcus said. "Maybe there's another way out." We had no choice. Behind us was solid rock, and the creature was already starting to regenerate, its crushed bones reforming with wet, cracking sounds. We ran for the open doorway, leaping over the thrashing thing on the ground. The interior of the building was worse than I'd imagined. It was much larger inside than the exterior suggested, with stone corridors leading off in all directions. The walls were covered in more of those impossible symbols, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But the worst part was the people. They lined the corridors, dozens of them, standing against the walls in various states of decomposition. Some looked recent, hikers in modern gear, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Others were older, wearing clothes from decades past. All of them were perfectly preserved except for their eyes, which had been replaced by the same black voids I'd seen in David. And they were all staring at us. "Welcome," they said in unison, their voices creating a horrible chorus. "Welcome to the family." We ran, down corridors that seemed to stretch forever, past rooms filled with bones and rotting supplies. Behind us, I could hear them following, footsteps that echoed like gunshots in the confined space. Marcus was ahead of me, his headlamp beam dancing wildly as he sprinted through the maze of passages. "There," he shouted. "Light ahead." I could see it too, gray daylight filtering in from somewhere up ahead. We burst through a final doorway and found ourselves outside again, but not in the canyon. We were on a mountainside I didn't recognize, surrounded by dead trees under an overcast sky. "Where are we?" Marcus gasped. I checked my GPS again. Still nothing. We were nowhere, in a place that didn't exist on any map. The building behind us was already fading, becoming translucent like a mirage. In moments, it was gone completely, leaving only bare rock and scattered bones. "We have to get out of here," I said, "before they find us again." We started down the mountainside, picking our way carefully over loose scree and ice-covered rocks. The storm had passed, but the temperature was still dropping. Our breath formed thick clouds, and ice was beginning to form on our eyebrows and beards. Hours passed. The sun was setting when we finally saw something familiar, the wooden sign marking the Jarbidge Wilderness boundary. We were at least 5 miles from where we'd started, but somehow we'd found our way back to the main trail. My truck was still in the parking area, covered with snow but undamaged. We threw our packs in the back and drove away from that place as fast as the icy roads would allow. We didn't speak for the entire 2-hour drive back to Reno. What could we say? That our friend had been replaced by some kind of creature? That we'd discovered a building full of the dead in a place that didn't exist? Who would believe us? It wasn't until we reached the city lights that Marcus finally broke the silence. "David," he said quietly. "The real David. Do you think he's dead?" I finished. "Yeah, I think so. Probably since that first night." We reported David missing to the authorities the next day, telling them he'd wandered away from camp and hadn't returned. Search and rescue teams scoured the Jarbidge Wilderness for a week but found no trace of him. Eventually, the search was called off, and David Lopez was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. The official report blamed exposure and the unexpected storm, a tragic accident in one of Nevada's most remote wilderness areas. I never told them about the thing that had worn his face, or the building full of the dead, or the impossible geography that had trapped us in a place between worlds. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself, but I have proof that it really happened. 3 weeks after we returned, I was going through the photos on my camera when I found images I didn't remember taking. Pictures of the canyon that shouldn't exist, of the stone building with its impossible architecture, and in one photo, a group shot Marcus had taken of David and me by the lake on our first night, David's face was wrong, subtly wrong, in a way that only became apparent when I looked at it closely. His smile was too wide. His eyes reflected the camera flash like an animal's, and if I looked very carefully at the shadows behind him, I could see shapes that didn't belong. Tall, thin figures watching us from the tree line. They'd been hunting us from the very beginning. I've never gone camping again. Never even left the city limits of Reno if I can help it. Because sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back in that canyon, standing before that impossible building. And David is there, smiling his too wide smile, telling me that the others are waiting inside. Sometimes I wake up to find fresh dirt under my fingernails, though I can't remember digging anything. And twice now, I've found strange symbols carved into the walls of my apartment, the same spirals and angular shapes I saw in that place that doesn't exist. They're still out there, somewhere in the wilderness between worlds, and I think they're still looking for me. Last week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was only breathing at first. Then a familiar voice said, "Hello, James. I've missed you." It was David's voice. But David has been dead for 6 months. "Come back to the mountains," the voice continued. "The family is so hungry, and we have a space waiting just for you." I hung up and changed my phone number the next day, but I know it won't matter. They found me once before in a place that shouldn't exist. They can find me again. I'm writing this down because I need someone else to know what really happened in the Jarbidge wilderness. If I disappear, if I'm found dead in some impossible place, maybe someone will read this and understand. Don't go to the Jarbidge alone. Don't trust anyone who comes back from the deep wilderness acting strangely. And if you ever find yourself in a canyon that isn't on any map, with buildings that shouldn't exist, run. Run fast and don't look back, because some things in those mountains aren't meant to be found, and once they find you, they never really let you go. The phone is ringing again as I write this. I know who it is before I answer. David's voice calling me home to a place where the dead walk and hunger never dies. I think tonight I might answer. I think I'm ready to see my old friend again. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Ruby Mountains of northeastern Nevada, in a place that no longer exists on any map I've tried to find since. The plan was simple enough. 4 college friends reuniting for a weekend camping trip in Lamoille Canyon, celebrating Jake's promotion at his engineering firm. We'd done this before, smaller trips, closer to civilization, but this time Jake wanted something more remote. "Let's really get away from it all," he'd said, spreading topographical maps across his kitchen table 3 weeks prior. "No cell towers, no tourists, just us in the wilderness." I should have known better. I should have insisted we stick to the established campgrounds near Angel Lake. But there's something seductive about Jake's enthusiasm that's always been hard to resist. Even back in college, when he'd convince us to sneak into abandoned buildings or explore the steam tunnels beneath campus, his excitement was infectious. Sarah called it his golden retriever energy. Boundless, optimistic, and utterly convinced that everything would work out fine. Sarah Gonzalez was our voice of reason, the one who packed first aid kits and backup batteries while the rest of us forgot essentials like can openers. At 26, she was already a seasoned nurse practitioner, and her calm competence in crisis situations had saved our asses more times than I could count. If anyone could keep us safe out there, it was her. The 4th member of our group was Tommy Chen, Jake's roommate and my oldest friend. We'd known each other since middle school, bonded over a shared love of horror movies and an equally shared inability to take anything seriously. Tommy was the kind of guy who'd crack jokes during a funeral, not out of disrespect but because humor was his defense mechanism against everything dark and uncertain in the world. We met at Jake's place in Reno on Friday morning, our vehicles loaded with enough gear for a small expedition. The October air was crisp and clean, with that particular quality of light that only comes in the high desert, sharp and golden and infinite. Jake had chosen our destination carefully, a remote section of the Ruby Mountains, accessible only by a rough 4-wheel drive track that wound up from Lamoille Canyon into some of the most isolated country in Nevada. It's called Broken Arrow Basin, he explained, pointing to a spot on his GPS unit where the topo lines bunched together like a clenched fist. "My buddy from work says there's incredible fishing up there, and we'll have the whole place to ourselves. No permits required, no ranger stations, nothing but pure wilderness." The drive took longer than expected. The paved road through Lamoille Canyon was beautiful enough, towering granite walls and aspen groves already touched with autumn gold, but the turnoff Jake was looking for proved elusive. We spent an hour driving back and forth along the canyon floor, checking and rechecking GPS coordinates that seemed to shift every time we looked at them. "This is weird," Sarah said, leaning over my shoulder to study the screen. "The waypoint keeps jumping around. Is your GPS acting up?" I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising this far into the mountains, but the GPS should have been working fine. The satellite view kept pixelating and refreshing, showing terrain that didn't quite match what we could see through the windshield. "There," Tommy said suddenly, pointing through the passenger window. "That's gotta be it." The track was barely visible, twin ruts disappearing up a steep, rocky slope between two massive granite outcroppings. No signs, no trail markers, just a gap in the forest that looked like it might once have been a road. "You sure this is right?" I asked, but Jake was already grinning. "Only one way to find out." The climb was brutal. My Jeep, loaded down with gear and passengers, groaned and complained as we crawled up switchbacks that seemed designed to test the limits of physics. Loose shale cascaded down the hillside with every turn of the wheels, and more than once I found myself holding my breath as we balanced on narrow ledges with nothing but empty air on one side. "Jesus Christ, Jake," Tommy muttered, gripping the roll bar as we bounced over a particularly nasty section of broken rock. "Are you sure this leads anywhere? It looks like nobody's been up here in decades." But Jake was undeterred, consulting his GPS with the single-minded focus of a pilgrim following a holy vision. The device had stopped jumping around, now showing a steady path toward our destination, though the topographical features on the screen bore little resemblance to the jagged wilderness surrounding us. After 2 hours of grinding ascent, the track finally leveled out into a broad alpine meadow ringed by peaks that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. Broken Arrow Basin was everything Jake had promised and more, a hidden pocket of wilderness that felt untouched by human presence. A small lake reflected the mountains like polished obsidian, and a creek meandered through the grass, its water so clear I could count individual pebbles on the bottom. "Holy shit," Sarah breathed. "This is incredible." We set up camp in a grove of aspens near the lake's edge, the trees' yellow leaves creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the ground. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no aircraft, no distant human sounds of any kind. Just the whisper of wind through the aspens and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. That first evening passed like a dream. We cooked steaks over an open fire, shared stories and inside jokes, and marveled at a night sky so dense with stars it seemed like we could reach up and grab handfuls of them. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and shooting stars etched brilliant scratches across the darkness. "God, I'd forgotten what real night looks like," Sarah said, lying on her back with her head pillowed on her jacket. "In the city, you forget there's a whole universe up there." Tommy was already snoring in his sleeping bag, the day's drive having taken its toll. Jake sat poking at the fire with a stick, sending spirals of sparks up into the star-drunk sky. "Thanks for this," I told him, "for organizing everything. It's exactly what we all needed." He smiled, his face lit orange by the flames. "I told you this place was special." My buddy wasn't kidding. It's like stepping back in time, you know? Like we're the first people to ever see this. I should have paid more attention to the way he said that. Should have noticed the slight emphasis on first people, or the way his eyes seemed to reflect the firelight a little too brightly. But I was tired and content and lulled by the absolute peace of the place. Within minutes of crawling into my sleeping bag, I was fast asleep. I woke to the sound of Jake vomiting. The digital display on my watch read 3:17 a.m. The fire had died to glowing embers, and the air was cold enough to turn my breath into visible clouds. Jake was 20 feet away, bent over behind a fallen log, retching violently. "Hey," I called softly, not wanting to wake the others. "You okay?" He straightened up slowly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. In the starlight, his face looked pale and drawn. "Yeah, I'm fine. Must have been something I ate. That steak, maybe." But we'd all eaten the same steaks, and the rest of us felt fine. I watched him stumble back toward his sleeping bag, moving like a man much older than his 29 years. "You sure you don't need anything? Sarah's got some antacids in her pack." No, I'm good. Just need to sleep it off." He zipped himself back into his bag and was silent. But sleep didn't come easily after that. Every few minutes I'd hear him shifting around, muttering under his breath in a voice too low to make out the words. And once, around 4 a.m., I could have sworn I heard him laughing, a sound so soft and strange it might have been the wind. Morning brought coffee and the smell of bacon, and Jake seemed back to his normal self. He was up before the rest of us, already tending the fire and boiling water for coffee when I crawled out of my sleeping bag. "Feeling better?" I asked. "Much. Think it was just altitude or something. This is pretty high up. What, 8,000 feet?" "Something like that." I studied his face in the morning light. The pallor was gone, replaced by a healthy glow that made his skin seem almost luminous. "You look good. Better than good, actually." "Mountain air," he said, grinning. "Nothing like it." We spent the morning exploring the area around the lake. The fishing was indeed spectacular. Tommy pulled 3 fat cutthroat trout out of the water in less than an hour, using nothing but basic spinners and his own infectious enthusiasm. Sarah found a hot spring bubbling up from between some boulders on the far shore, the water clear and warm and sulfur-scented. "This is like a spa resort," she said, dipping her hand into the steaming pool. "Except instead of paying $300 a night, we're getting it for free." It was Jake who suggested we explore further into the basin. "There's supposed to be some old mining claims up that way," he said, pointing toward a notch between 2 peaks. "Might be interesting to check out." The hike took us through increasingly rugged terrain. The game trail we'd been following petered out after a mile, leaving us to pick our way through talus slopes and stands of stunted pine. But Jake pressed on with determined enthusiasm, consulting his GPS and muttering about landmarks that none of the rest of us could see. "How much further?" Sarah asked after we'd been climbing for an hour. "This is getting pretty rough." "Not far now," Jake called back. "Just over this next ridge." But there was always another ridge, always one more rise to climb. The sun was high overhead by the time we finally stopped for a rest, and I was beginning to feel the first prickles of real concern. "Jake, we should head back," I said. "We've been at this for 3 hours, and we need to get back to camp before dark." 10 more minutes, he said. "I swear, it's just up ahead." Tommy was bent over, hands on his knees, breathing hard. "Dude, I'm dying here. What exactly are we looking for?" "You'll know it when you see it." There was something in Jake's voice that made me look at him more closely. His eyes were bright, too bright, and there was a tension in his posture that seemed almost predatory. When he smiled, I noticed that his teeth looked sharper than I remembered. "Jake!" "There," he said, pointing ahead. "I told you." I turned to follow his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice water. It wasn't a mining claim. It was a camp. Or what had once been a camp. 3 small tents were scattered around a clearing, their fabric weathered and torn. A cold fire ring sat in the center, filled with ashes so old they'd turned to powder. Backpacks and sleeping bags lay scattered around the site, some torn open as if by claws. "Jesus," Tommy whispered. "What happened here?" Sarah was already moving toward one of the tents, her nurse's instincts overriding her caution. "Hello," she called. "Is anyone here? Do you need help?" The tent she'd approached was unzipped, its flap hanging open like a mouth. She knelt down and peered inside, then recoiled with a sharp intake of breath. "What is it?" I asked. There's something in here. Clothes, I think. But they're—" She swallowed hard. "They're laid out like someone was wearing them, but there's no one inside." I looked around the campsite with growing unease. Now that I was looking more closely, I could see that all the tents were the same, unzipped from the inside, empty of people but full of personal belongings. Boots sat beside sleeping bags as if their owners had simply stepped out of them. Watches and jewelry glinted in the filtered sunlight. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Now." "Relax," Jake said. "They probably just went for a hike, got caught in bad weather or something." "Jake, look at this place. Look at how old everything is. This camp has been abandoned for months, maybe years. Has it?" I turned to stare at him. There was something wrong with his voice, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What did you say?" He was smiling again, that same bright, sharp smile. "I said, has it? Are you sure about that, Mike?" I looked back at the campsite and felt the world tilt sideways. The tents no longer looked weathered and old. The fabric was clean, the colors bright. Steam rose from a coffee pot sitting beside the fire ring, and I could see fresh food laid out on a camp table that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. "What the hell?" Tommy's voice was tight with fear. "That wasn't here before. None of this was here." Sarah grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Right now." But when we turned around, Jake was gone. "Jake!" I called. "Jake!" No answer. The forest around us was silent as a tomb. "This is fucked," Tommy said. "This is seriously fucked. We need to get back to camp and call for help." "There's no cell service up here," Sarah reminded him. "We're on our own." We spent the next hour searching for Jake, calling his name until our voices were hoarse, but it was like he'd simply vanished into thin air. Finally, with daylight beginning to fade, we had no choice but to head back toward our own camp. The return trip was a nightmare. Without Jake's GPS and his seemingly supernatural ability to navigate the unmarked terrain, we found ourselves lost within the first mile. Game trails that had seemed clear on the way up now branched and diverged into a maze of possibilities. Landmarks I was sure I remembered proved elusive, hidden behind ridges or obscured by stands of trees. "Are we going the right way?" Sarah asked. I wished I could give her a confident answer. The truth was, I had no idea. The mountains all looked the same now, jumbled granite peaks that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. My compass spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north. "Let's just keep heading downhill," I said. "Eventually we'll hit the creek, and we can follow that back to the lake." But downhill led us into a narrow canyon that I didn't remember climbing through on the way up. The walls pressed in on either side, topped by a strip of sky so narrow it might have been a crack in the earth. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, coming back to us distorted and multiplied. "I don't like this," Tommy said. "This feels wrong." He was right. Everything about the canyon felt wrong. The way the shadows fell, the quality of the light, the subtle wrongness in the echoes of our voices. It was like walking through a funhouse mirror version of the mountains we'd been hiking through all day. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly. "Do you hear that?" I stopped walking and held my breath. At first there was nothing, just the sound of wind moving through the canyon. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound like someone breathing heavily or laughing. "Jake," I called. The sound stopped immediately. "Jake, is that you? We've been looking for you." Silence. Then, from somewhere ahead of us in the canyon, "Michael." It was Jake's voice, but there was something wrong with it. It was too low, too resonant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Jake, where are you?" "I'm here, Michael. I'm right here." But there was no one in sight. The canyon stretched ahead of us, empty and shadowed. "This is bullshit," Tommy said. "Jake, quit fucking around. We're cold and tired and we want to go back to camp." "Tommy." The voice came from a different direction now, from somewhere behind us. "Tommy, my old friend." We spun around, but the canyon behind us was as empty as the path ahead. "What's wrong with his voice?" Sarah whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run. But run where? We were lost in a maze of stone, and something that sounded like our friend but wasn't our friend was playing games with us in the growing darkness. "We need to find a way out of this canyon," I said. "Now." But as we started walking again, I realized that the canyon had changed. Where there had been one path before, now there were three, diverging into the mountain like the fingers of a hand. I stared at the branching passages, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. "Those weren't there before," Sarah said. "Maybe we just didn't notice them." "Mike!" Her voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. "Those passages weren't there before." The sound of breathing came again, closer now. It seemed to be coming from all three passages at once, a chorus of respiratory whispers that made my skin crawl. Michael, Tommy, Sarah. Jake's voice, but speaking our names like he was tasting them. "Why are you running from me?" "Because you're not Jake," Sarah said loudly. "Whatever you are, you're not our friend." Laughter echoed from the stone walls. Jake's laughter, but wrong, twisted into something predatory and hungry. "Of course I'm Jake. I'm exactly who I've always been. I just understand things now. I see things clearly." "See what?" I called back. "How hungry I am." The temperature in the canyon seemed to drop 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs and ice began forming on the rock walls around us. "Run," I whispered. We took the middle passage, sprinting through the narrowing corridor as Jake's laughter followed us, bouncing off the walls and multiplying until it sounded like a dozen voices sharing the same terrible joke. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the mountain's heart. Behind us, I could hear footsteps, but they didn't sound right. They came too fast, with a rhythm that suggested something moving on more than two legs. And underneath the sound of pursuit, there was another noise. A low, constant growling that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. "There," Sarah pointed ahead. "Light." The passage opened onto a wide ledge overlooking a valley I'd never seen before. The terrain below was wrong, twisted and barren, dotted with the bleached bones of trees that looked more like reaching fingers than any vegetation that should exist at this altitude. In the distance, I could see structures that might have been buildings, but they were too far away and too distorted by heat shimmer to make out clearly. "Where are we?" Tommy gasped. I checked my compass again. The needle spun wildly, pointing first north, then south, then settling on a direction that couldn't possibly be correct. "I don't know." "Well, we can't go back," Sarah said. She was right. The passage behind us had filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source, and somewhere in those shadows, something was laughing. We made our way down into the valley, following what might have been a game trail through the dead landscape. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the crunch of our footsteps on ground that felt unstable beneath our feet. "This isn't Nevada," Tommy said. "This isn't anywhere." I was beginning to think he was right. The geography was all wrong, the sky was the wrong color, and the air tasted of copper and old meat. We weren't in the Ruby Mountains anymore. We weren't anywhere that existed on any map. "Look," Sarah said, pointing ahead. One of the distant structures was closer now, close enough to make out details. It was a cabin, or had been once. The walls were made of logs so old they'd turned black, and the roof sagged under the weight of something that might have been snow but looked too dark, too organic. "Should we check it out?" Tommy asked. "Do we have a choice?" The cabin was empty, but it felt occupied. Personal belongings were scattered around the single room. Clothes, books, camping gear. A fire had been built in the stone fireplace, but the ashes were cold. On the rough wooden table sat 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 sets of utensils. As if someone had been expecting us. "This is fucked," Tommy said again. "This is seriously, completely fucked." I picked up one of the books from the table. It was a journal, the pages filled with handwriting I didn't recognize. The entries were dated, starting 3 weeks ago. Day 1. Made it to Broken Arrow Basin. Jake says this place is special. Going to be an amazing trip. Day 3. Jake's been acting strange. Went off by himself last night. When he came back, he seemed different, hungry. Day 5. Tommy's missing. Jake says he went for a walk and got lost, but I found blood on the rocks near the lake. Sarah thinks we should leave, but Jake won't let us. Day 7. Sarah's gone now too. It was Jake. I saw him do it, but it wasn't Jake. Jake doesn't have teeth like that. Jake doesn't move like that. Jake doesn't. The entry ended abruptly, the pen trailing off into a jagged line across the page. "Guys," I said, but when I looked up, Tommy and Sarah were gone. The cabin was empty except for me and the sound of my own breathing. On the table, 2 of the 3 plates had been cleared away, leaving only mine and a single set of utensils. "Michael." I spun around. Jake stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. But his proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with fingers that hung down past his knees. "I've been waiting for you," he said. "You're not Jake." "I'm exactly Jake, just improved, evolved. Do you know how long I've been hungry, Michael? How long I've been waiting for someone to stumble into my valley?" The thing that had been Jake stepped into the cabin, and I got my first clear look at what it had become. The basic shape was human, but everything else was wrong. Its skin was pale and translucent, showing the dark network of veins beneath. Its eyes were black from lid to lid, and when it smiled I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth that went back far into its throat. "The others were good," it said, licking its lips with a tongue that was too long and too dark. "But I've been saving you for last. Best friends should always be savored." I backed away until I hit the wall, my mind gibbering with terror. "What are you?" "I'm what happens when hunger gets so deep it becomes everything. I'm what lives in the spaces between maps, feeding on anyone stupid enough to wander into my territory." It tilted its head, studying me like a bug under glass. "Your friend Jake? He made such interesting sounds when I peeled his skin off. Would you like to hear them?" The voice that came out of the thing's mouth was perfect. Jake's voice, speaking Jake's words with Jake's intonations. But underneath it, I could hear something else, a wet, grinding sound like bones being crushed. "Sarah tried to run," it continued conversationally. "Made it almost a quarter mile before I caught up with her. Tommy just stood there crying. Disappointing, really. I was hoping for more sport." I lunged for the door, but the creature moved faster than anything human could move. One moment it was across the room. The next, it was directly in front of me, blocking my escape. Now, it said, placing one impossibly long finger against my chest. "That's not very polite. I prepared a lovely meal for us." On the table, the remaining plate was no longer empty. It was piled high with meat that was still red and wet. Beside it sat a cup filled with something dark that steamed in the cold air. "Fresh," the creature said proudly. "I only just finished preparing it." The smell hit me then, the overwhelming stench of copper and decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach lurch. I vomited, doubling over as my body tried to expel everything I'd eaten in the last 24 hours. When I straightened up, the creature was smiling with Jake's face. That's exactly how Jake reacted when he first saw me feeding, right before I showed him what real hunger looks like. It reached for me with those 2 long fingers, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the oil lamp from the table and smashed it against the creature's face. The glass shattered, sending burning oil across its features. The thing shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and stumbled backward, clawing at its face. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin. I ran. The landscape outside had changed again. Now it was snowing, though the flakes that fell weren't white but a dirty gray that left dark stains where they landed. The dead trees creaked and swayed in a wind I couldn't feel, and in the distance I could see lights that moved too purposefully to be stars. Behind me, the thing that had been Jake came bursting out of the cabin, half its face burned away to reveal the skull beneath. But even as I watched, the damaged flesh began to regenerate, growing back like some obscene time-lapse video. "Michael!" it called in Jake's voice. "Michael, wait! You don't understand. I just want to share this with you." I ran across the valley floor, my feet slipping on ground that felt soft and yielding, like running across a carpet of meat. The lights in the distance were closer now, and I could see that they weren't lights at all, but eyes. Dozens of glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. More of them. More creatures like the thing that had taken Jake's shape. "Welcome to my family," Jake's voice called from behind me. "They're so excited to meet you." The eyes began moving toward me, converging from all directions. I could hear their voices now. Whispers and sighs and the wet sound of something large moving through liquid. They spoke in the voices of people I'd known. People who must have wandered into this place over the years and become food for things that wore their faces afterward. "Jason, buddy, is that you? We've missed you so much. Come play with us, Michael. We have such wonderful games. Don't you want to see your friends again? We're all here." I stumbled and fell, my hands sinking into the soft ground up to the wrists. When I pulled them free, they were covered in something dark and sticky that smelled like old blood. "There's nowhere to run," Jake's voice said. The creature was close now, so close I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. "This is my place, my hunting ground. The only way out is through me." I rolled over, expecting to see death reaching for me with Jake's face. Instead, I saw open sky. I was lying in my sleeping bag beside the lake in Broken Arrow Basin. Pale, morning light filtered through the aspens, and I could hear the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Tommy was snoring softly nearby, and Sarah was curled up in her bag with just the top of her head visible. For a moment, I couldn't move. The nightmare had been so vivid, so absolutely real, that part of me was convinced I was still trapped in that impossible valley. But slowly, gradually, the familiar sounds and smells of our campsite convinced me that I was awake. A dream. It had all been a horrible, incredibly detailed dream. I sat up, my heart still racing, and looked around for Jake. His sleeping bag was empty, unzipped from the inside. At first, that sight sent another spike of terror through me, but then I remembered. He'd been sick during the night. Probably just went to take a piss or splash some water on his face. "Jake?" I called softly. No answer. I climbed out of my bag and walked to the edge of the lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the peaks that surrounded us like a mirror. There was no sign of Jake anywhere. "Jake!" I shouted. Tommy sat up with a start. "What? What's going on?" "Jake's missing." Sarah was awake now too, immediately alert in the way that medical professionals learn to be. "Missing? How? When did you last see him?" "He was sick during the night. I thought he'd just gone to take care of business, but..." I gestured at his empty sleeping bag. We spent the morning searching, calling his name until our voices echoed off the granite walls. But it was like he'd simply vanished. His gear was still at the campsite, his boots still sitting beside his sleeping bag. Wherever he'd gone barefoot and wearing only the clothes he'd slept in. "We need to get help," Sarah said. "This isn't something we can handle alone." But when we tried to drive out, we discovered that the track we'd followed up to the basin had vanished. Where there had been a rough but passable road the day before, now there was only unbroken forest. Tommy and I spent hours hiking through the trees, searching for any sign of the path, but it was like it had never existed. "This is impossible," Tommy said. "Roads don't just disappear." But apparently they did. We were stranded in a place that shouldn't exist, missing a friend who might never have been there at all. That night, as we sat around our fire discussing what to do next, I heard Jake's voice calling from across the lake. "Michael, Tommy, Sarah." We all heard it, clear as day, unmistakably Jake's voice calling our names from the darkness beyond the water. "Jake!" Sarah shouted back. "Where are you?" "I'm here," came the answer. "I'm right here. Why don't you come find me?" Tommy was already reaching for his flashlight, but I grabbed his wrist. "Don't." "What? Why not? It's Jake. He needs help." "Listen to his voice, Tommy. Really listen." We sat in silence, and Jake's voice came again. "I'm so hungry, Michael. So very, very hungry. Won't you come feed me?" The voice was Jake's, but the words were wrong. Jake didn't talk like that. Jake wouldn't say things like that. "What's happening here?" Sarah whispered. I thought about my dream, about the creature with Jake's face and needle teeth, about the journal I'd found in the cabin, with its descriptions of friends going missing one by one. "I think we need to leave," I said. "Right now. Tonight." "How? The road's gone." "Then we hike out. We follow the stream down the canyon until we hit the main road." "In the dark? That's insane." "Michael." Jake's voice was closer now, coming from just beyond the circle of firelight. "Why are you whispering about me? That's not very nice." I looked toward the sound and saw a shape moving in the darkness, tall and thin and wrong, with arms that hung down too far and a face that was pale in the reflected firelight. "That's not Jake," I said. The shape stepped into the light, and I saw that I was both right and wrong. It was Jake, same face, same hair, same crooked smile, but his eyes were black from lid to lid, and when he opened his mouth to speak, I could see rows of teeth that went back into his throat like a shark's. "Of course I'm Jake," he said in Jake's voice. "Who else would I be?" Sarah screamed. The thing wearing Jake's face turned toward her, tilting its head like a curious animal. "Sarah," it said fondly. "Sweet Sarah, I've been thinking about you all day, about how you'll taste, about the sounds you'll make." Tommy grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it out like a weapon. "Stay back. Whatever you are, just stay the fuck back." Jake laughed, his normal, infectious laugh that I'd heard 1,000 times before. But coming from that pale face with those black eyes, it was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. "Tommy, Tommy, Tommy, still the funny man, even now. Do you want to hear a joke? Here's a joke. What's the last thing your friends saw before they died?" "Our friends aren't dead," Sarah said, but her voice was shaking. "Aren't they? Are you sure about that?" "Sarah, because I remember peeling their skin off. I remember the way they screamed when I showed them what I really was." The creature took a step closer, and I could see that its feet were wrong too. Too long, with too many joints, ending in claws instead of toes. "Run!" I whispered. "What?" "Run!" We scattered in different directions, crashing through the aspens in blind panic. Behind us, Jake's laughter followed, joined by other voices. Tommy's voice, Sarah's voice, my own voice calling out from the darkness. "Michael, where are you going? This is such a fun game." "Sarah, don't leave me here alone. I'm scared." "Tommy, help me. It's got me. It's got me." But I could see Tommy running ahead of me, and Sarah was off to my left, so the voices were lies. More of the creatures, wearing the faces and voices of my friends. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a fallen tree deep in the forest. The voices continued calling for a while, then gradually faded into silence. Hours passed. The moon set, leaving the forest in absolute darkness. I huddled behind the log, listening for any sound that might indicate pursuit, but heard nothing except the normal sounds of night. Owls hooting, branches creaking in the wind. When dawn finally came, I cautiously made my way back toward the lake. Our campsite was exactly as we'd left it, with one exception. 3 sleeping bags lay empty beside the cold ashes of our fire, all unzipped from the inside. I was alone. I spent that day gathering supplies and trying to find a way out of the basin. But every trail I followed led back to the lake. Every ridge I climbed looked down on the same impossible geography. It was like being trapped inside a puzzle box with no solution. That evening, as I sat beside my rebuilt fire, they came back. All 3 of them, Jake, Tommy, and Sarah, walking out of the forest like they'd just returned from a pleasant hike. They looked exactly like themselves, dressed in the same clothes they'd been wearing when we ran. The only difference was their eyes, which were black from lid to lid. "Michael," Jake called out cheerfully. "There you are. We've been looking everywhere for you." "Where did you go?" Sarah asked, sitting down beside the fire like nothing had happened. "We woke up, and you were gone." "We were so worried," Tommy added. I stared at them, my mind reeling. They looked perfect, exactly like my friends with all the right mannerisms and expressions. If it hadn't been for their eyes, I might have believed they were real. "You're not them," I said. Jake looked hurt. "Of course we are. Who else would we be?" "You're the things that killed them." "Killed them?" Sarah laughed. "Michael, we're right here. Do we look dead to you?" They looked alive. They looked healthy and happy and completely normal except for those terrible black eyes. But I remembered the creature from the night before, remembered its needle teeth and 2 long limbs. "Show me your teeth," I said. "What?" Tommy frowned. "That's a weird request, man. Show me your fucking teeth." For just a moment, their faces flickered. The friendly expressions slipped, revealing something hungry and predatory underneath. Then the masks were back in place. "You're being paranoid," Jake said. "Come on, let's get some sleep. We'll figure out how to get home in the morning." "No." "Michael!" I said no. I grabbed my pack and ran, plunging into the forest without any destination in mind. Behind me, their voices called out, concerned, loving, perfectly mimicking the way my real friends would have sounded. "Michael, wait! You're scaring us. Don't leave us here alone." But I kept running, because I knew that whatever was calling to me with my friends' voices, it wasn't my friends anymore. I've been running for 3 days now, or maybe 3 weeks, or 3 months. Time doesn't seem to work properly in this place. The sun rises and sets, but always in the wrong places, and sometimes it's 2 suns, or no sun at all. The landscape shifts when I'm not looking directly at it, leading me through forests that shouldn't exist and over mountains that rearrange themselves behind me. They follow me everywhere. Not just Jake and Tommy and Sarah, but others now, people I've never seen before, wearing faces they stole from previous victims. They call to me constantly, promising food and warmth and companionship, promising an end to the loneliness. Sometimes I'm tempted to listen. Sometimes the isolation gets so bad that even their company seems preferable to being alone. But then I remember Jake's teeth, remember the journal in the cabin, and I keep running. I don't know if there's a way out of this place. I don't know if the real world even exists anymore, or if I've fallen so far down the rabbit hole that there's no way back up. But I'm going to keep trying, because the alternative is becoming like them. Another hungry thing wearing a stolen face. The worst part is the doubt. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if I'm the crazy one. Maybe Jake and Tommy and Sarah really are alive and safe, and I'm just having some kind of psychotic break. Maybe I'm the one who's lost his mind. Maybe I'm the danger. But then I look at my hands, and they're still my hands. I look in the still water of mountain streams, and my eyes are still brown, not black. I'm still human, still myself, still fighting. Last night I found another campsite, fresh gear scattered around a fire that was still warm, 3 sleeping bags unzipped from the inside, and sitting on a log nearby, a journal with entries that ended abruptly. Day 4. Jake's been acting strange since we got here, says he found something in the woods, something that's been waiting for us. Day 6. Tommy's missing. Jake says he's just exploring, but I don't believe him. There's something wrong with Jake's eyes. Day 8. I can hear them calling to me from the forest. Jake and Tommy using their voices. But I saw Jake yesterday, and he's not Jake anymore. His face is wrong. His mouth is wrong. Day 9. They're all here now, all my friends, standing around the fire like nothing happened. But they're not my friends. I don't know what they are, but they're not. The same story, over and over. How many groups has this place taken? How many people have wandered into Broken Arrow Basin and never come out? I'm writing this down because I need to remember. Because sometimes, in the depths of exhaustion and despair, I start to forget what's real and what isn't. I start to think that maybe I should just give up, go back to the lake and accept their invitation to join them. But I won't. I can't. Because somewhere out there, in the real world, people need to know what happened here. They need to know about the place that isn't on any map, about the things that wear familiar faces and hunt with stolen voices. If you're reading this, if somehow this journal makes it out even though I don't, then please, stay away from the Ruby Mountains. Stay away from any place called Broken Arrow Basin. And if you ever meet someone who claims to be Jake Anderson or Tommy Chen or Sarah Gonzalez, if they invite you camping in a beautiful, isolated place that no one else knows about, run. Run and don't look back. Because some hungers are older than civilization, and they're always looking for new faces to wear. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Ruby Mountains of northeastern Nevada, in a place so remote that even the GPS satellites seemed to give up trying to find us. I should have known something was wrong when David started acting strange on the drive up. My best friend since college, David Jones, had always been the steady one between us, the guy who planned everything down to the last granola bar and backup battery pack. But as we wound through the endless sagebrush flats toward the Lamoille Canyon trailhead, he kept checking his mirrors, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You see that truck behind us?" he asked for the third time in an hour. I turned around. The road stretched empty behind us, heat waves rising from the asphalt like ghostly fingers. "Dave, there's nobody back there. There hasn't been for the last 50 miles. He nodded, but his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. Yeah, you're right. We'd planned this trip for months. 3 days deep in the Ruby Wilderness, away from cell towers and civilization, and the crushing weight of our dead-end jobs back in Reno. David worked in IT for an insurance company, and I pushed papers for the state. We both needed this escape, this chance to remember what silence sounded like. The Lamoille Canyon Road climbed through golden aspen groves, their leaves already turning with the early September chill. David had chosen our route carefully, a 12-mile hike into the remote Thomas Canyon drainage, where the old mining claims were slowly being reclaimed by wilderness. We'd camp at Favre Lake, fish for brook trout, and pretend we were mountain men instead of cubicle dwellers. "You remember the stories about this place?" David asked as we shouldered our packs at the trailhead. His voice sounded forced, like he was trying too hard to be casual. "What stories?" The Shoshone used to avoid these mountains. Called them spirit lands. Said things lived up here that weren't quite natural. I laughed, adjusting my pack straps. "Since when do you believe in ghost stories?" "I don't." But his eyes scanned the tree line with nervous energy. "Just saying, we should be careful. People go missing up here more than you'd think." The trail started easy, winding through meadows dotted with lupine and Indian paintbrush. But as we climbed higher, the landscape began to change. The trees grew thicker, older, their branches forming a canopy so dense that midday felt like twilight. The usual mountain sounds, birds, wind through pine needles, the distant chatter of squirrels, gradually faded until our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. "It's quiet," David muttered, voicing what I'd been thinking. "Mountain quiet. That's what we came for, remember?" But this wasn't the peaceful silence I'd expected. This felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Even our conversation died as we hiked, each of us lost in our own thoughts as the trail switchbacked through increasingly alien terrain. We reached our intended campsite at Favre Lake just as the sun was beginning to set. The lake sat in a perfect glacial cirque, surrounded by granite walls that caught the last light and threw it back in bloody shades of red and orange. It should have been beautiful. Instead, something about the place made my skin crawl. "Look at the water," David said. The lake's surface was perfectly still, like black glass. No insects disturbed it, no fish rose to feed. Even the wind seemed to die when it reached the water's edge. "Probably too cold for much life," I said, but my voice sounded thin in the silence. We made camp on a flat spot above the lake's eastern shore, going through the familiar routine of setting up tents and organizing gear. David was meticulous as always, checking and double-checking every stake and guy line, but I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to find someone watching us. "Dave, you okay? You've been jumpy all day." He paused in the middle of rolling out his sleeping bag. For a moment, I thought he was going to tell me something important. Then he shook his head. "Just tired. Long drive." We cooked a simple dinner on David's camp stove. Instant pasta with dried vegetables. Even the smell of food seemed muted in the thin air. As darkness fell, we built a small fire, more for the psychological comfort than warmth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, creating shapes that seemed to move with purpose. "Tell me about that truck you thought you saw," I said, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. David poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night. "Probably nothing. White pickup, couple miles back. Thought I saw it a few times, always hanging back just far enough that I couldn't make out the plates." "Paranoid much?" "Maybe." He was quiet for a long moment. "Mike, can I tell you something? Something weird happened last week." I waited, watching his face in the firelight. David wasn't prone to dramatics, which made his obvious distress more unsettling. "I was working late, trying to finish that server migration project. About 11 p.m., I'm the only one left in the building. I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my office. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. Security guard? That's what I thought. But when I looked out, the hallway was empty. Motion sensors weren't even triggered. The lights were still off." He shivered despite the fire's warmth. "So I went back to work, figured I was hearing things. But then I heard them again, and this time they stopped right outside my door." The fire popped, making both of us jump. "What did you do?" "Opened the door. Had to, but there was nobody there. Just..." He struggled for words. "Just this smell, like wet earth and something rotting, and the feeling that whatever had been there was still watching me, just somewhere I couldn't see." A log shifted in the fire, sending shadows racing across our campsite. I found myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond our small circle of light. "You think someone's been following you?" "I think something's been following me." The words hung in the air between us. Look, I know how that sounds, but every night since then, I've had the same dream. I'm hiking through a forest that looks exactly like this one, and something's behind me. Never close enough to see clearly, but close enough that I can hear it breathing. "Dave, it's not human breathing, Mike. It's too deep, too wet, and in the dream, I know that if I turn around, if I actually see what's following me, something terrible will happen." We sat in silence after that, both of us staring into the flames. I wanted to tell him he was being ridiculous, that stress was getting to him, that there was nothing in these mountains except trees and rocks and maybe a few bears. But something about the absolute stillness around us made rational explanations feel hollow. The fire burned low, and we banked it for the night. David's tent was pitched about 10 feet from mine, close enough that we could talk quietly if needed. As I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I heard him moving restlessly in his tent. "Mike, you awake?" "Yeah." "Thanks for coming up here with me. I know I've been acting weird, but I needed to get away from everything. Needed someone I trust watching my back." "Always, man. That's what friends are for." But as I lay there listening to the silence, I wondered what exactly I was supposed to be watching for. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of David talking in his sleep. His voice was muffled by the tent fabric, but I could make out fragments. "Not supposed to be here. Wrong place. It knows we're here." Then, abruptly, the talking stopped. I lay still, listening. The silence was complete. No wind, no insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush. Even the usual mountain sounds that you don't notice until they're gone had vanished entirely. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were exactly as David had described. Slow, deliberate, but with something off about the rhythm. Too long between steps, as if whatever was walking was taking time to consider each placement. The sound came from somewhere beyond our campsite, moving parallel to the lakeshore. I held my breath, straining to pinpoint the location. The footsteps seemed to be circling us, always staying just beyond the edge of where our fire's light had reached. They would pause for long moments, then resume, always maintaining that same unnatural cadence. "Dave," I whispered. No response. "Dave!" Still nothing. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on and immediately regretting the decision. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the normal landscape of our campsite, but also destroying my night vision. Now, I couldn't see anything beyond that narrow cone of light, while whatever was out there could probably see me perfectly. I clicked off the light and lay still, heart pounding. The footsteps had stopped when the light came on. Now there was only silence, but it felt different. Expectant, as if something was waiting for me to make the next move. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of empty forests and watching eyes. I woke to gray dawn light filtering through my tent walls. My sleeping bag was damp with cold sweat, and my mouth tasted like fear. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The camping trip, David's strange behavior, the footsteps in the night. "Dave?" I called out. "You awake?" No answer. I unzipped my tent and crawled out into the chill morning air. David's tent was zipped shut, and I could see the shape of his sleeping bag through the orange fabric. He was probably just sleeping deeply. We'd both been exhausted from the long hike. But something made me walk over and call his name again. "Dave, time to get up, man." Still no response. I reached for his tent zipper, then hesitated. There was something wrong with the shape inside. It was too still, too perfectly positioned. When people sleep, they move, shift position, create wrinkles and irregularities in their bedding. This looked like a sleeping bag arranged to look occupied. I pulled the zipper down. The sleeping bag was empty, unzipped from the inside, with David's clothes folded neatly at the foot. His hiking boots were gone, but everything else, wallet, car keys, even his prescription glasses, remained in the tent. "David!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the granite walls. "David!" I searched the immediate area, looking for tracks, signs of struggle, anything that might explain his disappearance. The soft earth around our campsite should have held footprints clearly, but I found only my own prints from the night before, and strange marks that didn't quite look human. Too long, with what appeared to be claw marks at the toe. I tried my cell phone, knowing it was useless. No signal, as expected. We were at least 12 miles from the nearest road, and that was if I could find my way back through the maze of game trails and defunct mining roads we'd used to reach this place. The rational thing to do was pack up and hike out immediately. Get help, bring in search and rescue. But something kept me from leaving. Maybe it was loyalty to David, or maybe it was the growing certainty that whatever had taken him was still nearby, watching. I spent the morning expanding my search, calling his name until my throat was raw. The forest remained stubbornly silent, giving back only the echo of my own voice. As the sun climbed higher, I began to notice other disturbing details. The trees around our campsite showed signs of damage, deep scratches in the bark, branches broken at head height, as if something large had passed through recently. And there was a smell, faint at first, but growing stronger as the day warmed. The scent of decay, of things long dead left to rot in dark places. By afternoon, I had to accept that I wasn't going to find David on my own. I began breaking camp, intending to hike out and get help, but as I rolled up my sleeping bag, I heard something that made my blood freeze. David's voice, calling my name from somewhere across the lake. "Mike! Mike! Help me!" I dropped my gear and ran toward the sound, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs. The voice seemed to come from the far shore, where the forest was thickest. As I rounded the lake's southern end, I saw him. David stood among the trees about 50 yards away, waving at me. Even at that distance, I could see he was smiling, a wide, unnatural smile that seemed too big for his face. "Dave, thank God I've been looking everywhere for you." I started toward him, relief flooding through me. "Where the hell have you been?" But as I got closer, that relief began to curdle into something else. David was wearing the same clothes he'd had on the night before, but they looked wrong somehow. Too clean, too perfectly arranged. And his smile never wavered, never changed, even when I called out to him. "Dave, you okay, man?" He didn't answer, just kept smiling and slowly backing deeper into the trees. There was something wrong with the way he moved, too. His gait was stiff, unnatural, like someone learning to walk in an unfamiliar body. I stopped about 20 feet away, suddenly reluctant to get closer. "David, what happened to you? Where did you go last night?" His head tilted to one side, that horrible smile still fixed in place. When he spoke, his voice sounded like David's, but the words came out wrong. Too measured, like someone reciting lines. "I went for a walk, Mike. I wanted to see the sunrise from the ridge. You were sleeping so peacefully, I didn't want to wake you. You left all your gear, your glasses. You can barely see without them. I can see perfectly now." His eyes caught the afternoon light, and for just a moment, they seemed to shine with their own inner glow. "Everything is much clearer than before." Something was very wrong here. This looked like David, sounded like David, but everything about his behavior was off. The David I knew was spontaneous, animated, quick to laugh. This thing wearing his face was too controlled, too perfect. "Dave, I think we should head back to camp, get our stuff and hike out, maybe get you checked out by a doctor." "Why would I need a doctor, Mike?" The smile widened even further, showing too many teeth. "I've never felt better in my life." That's when I noticed the smell again, that rotting, earthy odor I detected around our campsite. It was stronger here, emanating from the thing that looked like my friend. I took a step backward. "You're not David." The smile faltered for just a moment, and in that instant, I saw something else looking out through those familiar eyes. Something ancient and hungry and utterly alien. "Of course I'm David," it said, but the voice was different now, deeper, with an odd resonance that seemed to come from somewhere other than its throat. "We've been friends since college. I work in IT. I drive a blue Honda Civic. I have a scar on my knee from falling off my bike when I was 8. All true facts about David, but delivered in that same flat, recited tone, like something that had studied him but didn't really understand how to be him. "Where is he?" I demanded. "What did you do with my friend?" The thing tilted its head the other way, studying me with predatory interest. "David is right here, Mike. Can't you see him? We're all here now." It took a step toward me, and I saw that its feet weren't quite touching the ground. It moved with a gliding motion that made my skin crawl. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard it laugh, a sound like wind through a cemetery. But worse than the laugh was what came after. The sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, but something heavier, as if it had dropped all pretense of human movement and was now following on all fours. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths disappearing and reappearing, familiar landmarks changing position. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The sounds behind me grew closer. Whatever was chasing me was gaining ground, and I could hear it breathing, the deep, wet respirations that David had described from his dreams. I burst out of the tree line and found myself back at our campsite, though I could have sworn I'd been running in the opposite direction. My pack was where I'd left it, half loaded with camping gear. I grabbed my hiking poles and turned to face whatever was coming. The thing that wore David's face emerged from the forest, but it was changing as I watched. Its limbs were elongating, joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible. The smile was gone, replaced by a mouth that opened too wide, revealing rows of yellowed teeth that belonged to no human being. "You can't leave, Mike," it said in David's voice, though the words came from that horrible mouth. "You're part of the story now, just like David became part of me." I swung one of the hiking poles at its head, but it moved with impossible speed, catching the aluminum shaft in one twisted hand. The metal crumpled like paper. David fought too, at first, it continued conversationally. But in the end, he understood. He wanted to become something greater. Something that could walk between worlds, hunt in both shadow and flesh. "You're lying." "Am I?" It leaned closer and I could smell the decay on its breath. David called me Mike. His dreams, his fear, his desperate need to escape his small life. It all reached out across the veil. He wanted transformation, and I gave it to him. The thing that had been David reached for me with fingers that had grown too long, too thin. I stumbled backward, tripped over my own pack, and went down hard. It loomed over me, blocking out the sky. "Don't worry," it whispered. "You'll still be you in a way. Your memories, your knowledge, your skills. They'll all be part of me. And in return, you'll experience things that no purely human mind could comprehend." Its hand touched my forehead, and images flooded my mind. Visions of vast, empty spaces between the stars where things older than worlds drifted in eternal hunger. I saw David, or what remained of him, trapped somewhere in the depths of this creature's consciousness, screaming silently as his identity dissolved into something alien and terrible. But I also saw something else. A weakness. This thing, whatever it was, needed time to fully absorb its victims. David's transformation wasn't complete. There were still fragments of my friend trapped inside the monster. With my last coherent thought, I grabbed a burning stick from our campfire and thrust it into the creature's face. It shrieked and recoiled, the sound echoing off the granite walls like the cries of 1,000 dying animals. Where the flame touched its stolen flesh, the skin bubbled and peeled away, revealing something that looked like molten shadow underneath. I rolled away and grabbed my backpack, not bothering to organize anything. Stuffing whatever I could reach into the main compartment, I ran for the trail that would lead me out of this nightmare. The thing behind me was recovering, its cries turning to roars of rage. I could hear it giving chase again, but this time the sounds were different, less coordinated, more bestial. The trail down from Favre Lake was a blur of switchbacks and scree slopes. I fell repeatedly, tearing holes in my pants and scraping my hands raw on the rough granite. But each time I looked back, the creature was there, sometimes wearing David's face, sometimes showing its true form, a writhing mass of darkness that moved like liquid smoke through the trees. My lungs burned in the thin air, and my legs felt like rubber. I couldn't keep up this pace much longer. But as the trail descended into the main canyon, I began to hear something that filled me with desperate hope. The sound of running water. Lamoille Creek carved a path through the bottom of the canyon, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks. If the old stories were true, if creatures like the one pursuing me were bound by certain rules, running water might offer protection. I stumbled down the final slope and splashed into the creek. The water was shockingly cold, but I forced myself to wade upstream, hoping the current would mask my scent or confuse whatever senses the creature used to track me. Behind me, the forest erupted in fury. Trees crashed down, rocks split and tumbled, but the sounds grew more distant. And when I finally risked a look back, I saw it standing on the creek bank, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. It couldn't cross the water. I waded upstream for what felt like hours, following the creek as it wound through the canyon. My feet went numb with cold, and hypothermia began to set in, but I didn't dare leave the water. Only when I reached the paved road near the trailhead did I finally climb out and allow myself to collapse. The park ranger who found me huddled beside the road thought I was suffering from altitude sickness and exposure. I tried to tell him about David, about the thing in the forest, but the words came out as incoherent rambling. By the time I was coherent enough to give a proper statement, I'd had time to think about how the story would sound. So I told them David had fallen while scrambling on rocks near the lake, that I'd searched for him but couldn't find any trace, that I'd panicked and hiked out to get help. The search and rescue team spent 3 days combing the area around Favre Lake. They found our campsite, found David's gear, but no sign of David himself. No blood, no torn clothing, no indication of what might have happened to him. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to a climbing accident. His body was never recovered. I went to his funeral 2 weeks later. It was a closed casket service, which everyone understood given the circumstances. But I knew the truth. There was no body in that casket because David wasn't dead. He was something else now, something that wore his memories like a mask while hunting in the spaces between worlds. That was 3 months ago. I've tried to go back to my normal life, tried to pretend that what happened in the Ruby Mountains was just a stress-induced hallucination. But every night, I dream of that lake, that perfect black mirror surrounded by granite walls, and in those dreams, I can see David standing on the far shore, smiling that terrible smile, waiting for me to come back. Because I will go back, eventually. I can feel the pull of that place, the same call that David must have heard. It's in my blood now, in my bones, in the spaces between my thoughts. The creature didn't just take my friend, it left something behind, a seed of itself growing in the darkest corners of my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself researching the area, looking at topographic maps and weather reports, planning another trip. Telling myself I need to go back to find closure, to understand what really happened. But I know better. I know what's really drawing me back to those mountains, to that still black lake where things that shouldn't exist wait in patient hunger. The thing that took David is still up there, and it's not done with me yet. And the worst part? Sometimes, in my weakest moments, I find myself looking forward to seeing it again. Because David was right about one thing. His old life was small, limited, trapped in routines and expectations. What that creature offered, whatever terrible transformation it promised, was at least freedom from the endless gray monotony of human existence. I'm writing this down now, while I still can, while enough of me remains to remember why I should be afraid. Because I know that soon, very soon, I'll pack my gear and drive back up that lonely mountain road. I'll hike back to Favre Lake, and this time I won't run when David comes to greet me. The dreams are getting stronger, and his smile is getting wider, and I'm starting to smile back.